thank you for allowing me to share with you a few reflections on my work on the Quran history. My paper is about teaching the Quran in the early Islamic sources. I will, during this presentation, I will share with you a few analyses of early sources, early narrative sources, and I will share with you a few images at the end of some Quran manuscripts that would support some of the hypotheses I will talk about during this presentation. My topic is the formation and identity of the Quran text. In order to understand this aspect in the Quran history, I focus on the transmission of the Quran and more precisely on how the Quran was taught, how the text was learned by early Muslims in the early Islamic period. Of course, by early Islamic period, I refer to the 3 first centuries. I would like to suggest an approach to the topic based on my study of the Quran, as well as the history of transmission of other Islamic and pre-Islamic Arabic sources. At the core of this approach, the teaching milieu, the circle of transmission, in Arabic, al-halaqa, the interaction of scripture with other genres are, so as I said, are the core of this approach. I would like to convince you that to fully appreciate the early tradition, one must open the possibility of continuity between it and later scholastic tradition. This hypothesis stands not only from, it doesn't stand from a conviction that Islam has an essential and unchanging core. Rather, it is based on my work on evidence of early manuscripts of Quran, and also my work on the transmission of texts in the early period, and on the rules of textual transmission and the theory of textual criticism that has been produced by Islamic scholars between the 10th and 15th century. So somehow when I work on early material, I have in my perspective the relationship between the later rules and the early evidence, not to make them fit together to the opposite, but to also to the opposite. My aim is to see the gap and sometimes the intersection between the two historical periods. So in this paper, I will first mention some previous scholarship on the transmission of texts and its relationship to the Quran. One important observation is that paratextual literature, that means the comments, the marginal notes, the interlinear notes, what is written between the lines, has been insufficiently appreciated in this scholarship. Next, I will analyze some early narratives to discern different meanings of the reading of the Quran text. the reading, the recitation, the study, the variants, some concepts like codex, like the book of God. All these concepts occurred, or these terms occurred in some early texts, some early historical narratives, in historical sources. And I will show from this philological analysis how the meaning, the very meaning of qira'ah, of the Arabic word qira'ah, which means reading or recitation, and the texts related to it change over time. And this is essential to understand how the text has been taught, how it has been transmitted and learned by newly converted to Islam, and also by Muslims themselves. Specifically, I will show that the early period refers to the early teaching circle of the study of the Quran, and that its study, the study of the Quran text by the community of the first centuries, overlaps with the study of other texts historically surround the Quran. We know by several evidence that the Quran, of course, was not the only text that has been taught, that has been learned by Muslims during the first centuries. Finally, I will share with you a few images of fragments of Quran manuscripts that show marginal and interlinear comments proving what I take as evidence of the early activity of teaching circle and how this activity took place. And that also show us that we should consider in our teaching of the Islamic material, including the Quran. So that is to say, when we teach the text of the Quran, I think it's important to take into account the perspective that, the historical perspective that this text has been the object of teaching itself. So it is not, the text is not disconnected from the system or the dynamic of teaching in the early centuries. So somehow I'm also a teacher. I teach Quranic studies at the university. So when I teach the text of the Quran, I take into account that this text has been taught from the beginning, from the very beginning of its history. Early Muslim has had to learn it and to understand it. So it has been studied, commented, annotated, learned by heart, transmitted to others, transmitted by masters to disciples, and the disciples who become in their turn masters. The state of the field shows that the transmission of the Quran is not a new topic in Islamic studies. Unlike the approach of much of the field of the Quranic studies today, I situate my approach to the Quran in the broader scholarly context of transmission of knowledge in Islam. Since the pioneering works of George Vaida in the 70s and those of George Maqdisi in the 80s, the transmission of texts, including the Quran, occupied the work of major scholars of the 20th and the 21st century, such as Gregor Scholer, Stefan Leder, Jonathan Berke. Studies on textual transmission in Islam deal within 4 themes: the historicity versus authenticity of the Islamic texts, the textual composition and the issue of the dynamic relationship between fiction and history, the discovery and edition of new material, manuscripts, epigraphy, coins, etc. Canonization history, finally, canonization history that includes studying what is often named as the origins of the texts, not only the Quran, again. Studies on the origins were particularly applied, nevertheless, on the Quran in the recent 20 years. Previous scholarship in the history, textual history, Islamic history, gave major importance to the following questions. What is the history of transmission of a particular source text? Which texts had circulated at which historical period? For the early period, the question of what are the non-Islamic origins of the religious material was raised as well. The first question triggered methods of analysis of the chains of transmission. Names of authorities are identified and prophetic tradition material are analyzed using various methods of analysis of chains of transmission. This method, and it is related to the Quran history, as you will see, aims to identify the transmitters in order to confirm if they did historically exist or if they are fictive. It also determines at which historical period specific text material have circulated. Moreover, the non-Islamic origins of the religious texts, especially the Quran, triggered the interest of biblical studies scholars. By applying tools of textual criticism, they attempt to reconstruct the biblical layers that constitute the Quran literary composition. The last 2 decades gave major attention to the historicity of the Islamic religious material, Quran, and prophetic traditions, and other texts. These studies covered big part in the field and influenced more recent concerns about the non-Islamic origins of the Islamic tradition in general. So these trends did realize great achievements in the field, mainly making available important material like manuscripts, like coins, inscriptions, etc., offering an overview of the terminology of textual transmission, including the terminology of teaching and studying religious texts, including the Quran, of course. I'm referring here to the terminology of the science of transmission that includes lists of terms and concepts. One of them is the incontournable issue of oral versus written transmission and its rules and its functions. Analyzing major issues in history of foundational texts such as the crucial question of what is historical and what is authentic, because there is difference between historical and authentic. By authentic, I refer to the understanding or the representation of the history of the Muslim scholars of the 10th century and 10th and 11th century, those we might call the architects of authenticity. To the opposite, what is historical refers to what really did happen. And these are two completely different problematics. However, the field of Islamic studies, and more particularly Quranic studies, shows, in my view, three main challenges, despite all these achievements. First, in parallel to the discovery of new material, the field calls for new perspectives. Second, in parallel to the study of the text, the field calls for the study of the meta-textual material. Finally, the field calls for critical reflection on the previous scholarship. So my first section now is to talk about the necessity to overcome what I might call the isolated Quran. That means the approach, the academic approach that considers the Quran as an isolated text. By this, I mean that in our context here of how to teach the Quran is to overcome the idea that the Quran is totally disconnected from the other Arabic sources. One recent trend in the field of textual studies, including Quranic studies, is to take the Quran in isolation and separate it from non-Quranic Arabic sources. Indeed, this is sometimes considered as a methodological point. The main reason for this choice is to facilitate studying the Quran independently of the Arabic and para-Quranic literature, such as exegetical literature, prophetic traditions, etc. That might influence, according to this perspective that I'm criticizing now, this might influence the study of the Quran. This influence is considered as a danger threatening the neutrality of the investigation would derive from the political and ideological background of the para-Quranic material, compared by many scholars to kind of sunglasses that might affect our perception of the reality of the text. You remember, the reality, that means the historicity, what really happened. This, taken into consideration, this para-Quranic literature might prevent us from looking at the history of the text as we refer to it as what really happened in the early period. So this perspective is supposed by many scholars to have like the risk to modify our perception of history, of the history of the Quran. Although this method allows focusing on the textual composition, intertextuality, style, structure, and argumentation of the Quran text. The same method has, in my view, some limits because it sometimes extracts the text from the environment of its transmission, the Arabic environment of the early Islamic history, circles of teaching and studying the text. Moreover, the same method isolates the Quran from other Arabic texts. The same method of isolating the Quran from other Arabic texts migrates to many subfields, such as the Quran manuscript study. The Quran manuscript study as a subfield of Quranic studies in general. I will show that several blind spots in the field result from this method of considering, like, for example, a manuscript of the Quran as only a manuscript of the Quran, while the evidence, the manuscript evidence, show us sometimes that a manuscript of the Quran might contain other material and might be used to other purposes than the production of a codex of the Quran, of a Mus'haf. So I'm criticizing the fact that these methods do not take into consideration the connection between the Quran and other texts produced in the early Islamic period. Since the last century, textual studies have shown that various material circulated and were taught since the beginnings of Islam at the 7th century. Some of them precedes the preaching of the Prophet Muhammad, who died in 632 of the Common Era, and derives from pre-Islamic traditions, such as the literature of the so-called the days of the Arabs or the Reds of the Prophet, and the Judeo-Christian tradition. Within this context, Muslim scholars, transmitters of prophetic traditions, Quran readers, reciters, and commentators took part in the Islamization of the material. By Islamization, I mean the transmission of narratives within Islamic teaching, which elaborate sophisticated net of oral and written fragmented textual units that connect and disconnect and superimpose following layers of text making that will not be identified as religious genre before the 8th and 10th century. This mixture of literary religious genre will not be identified as genre before the 8th and 10th century, because this date is the one of the emergence of the first collections of narratives that will be progressively considered as authentic, and that will be progressively be canonized. And I have to say here, let me underline here that canonized should be understood in different ways according to the textual genre, genres, and also according to the tools of what we call in Western languages canon and canonization. That means canonization of the Quran and is is not the same as what we refer to as canonization of the other non-Islamic texts. And also canonization of the Quran is not similar to the canonization of hadith collections, for example, prophetic tradition material. Although the Quran text is part of abounding literary genre that circulate during the first centuries, it is supposed to have been fixed. Fixed, perhaps here I'm more using the French expression rather than English terminology, that has been definitively collected. This is what I'm meaning. At the second half of the 7th century. This is, of course, according to the Sunni accounts. I will not here get into a comparison between the different, the diversity of trends within the Islamic tradition, because as you know, this is, I mean, the perception of the Quranic history is slightly different between Sunni sources and Shia sources. So allow me here to speak from one perspective in order to avoid to focus on the comparison between within the Islamic tradition rather than to focus on my subject, which is the history of teaching the Quran in the early period. I would like to emphasize that the Quran is submitted to the same process of dissemination within fragmentary fashion before and after its canonization. Although this representation of the stability of the text, very early stability, which is more and more confirmed by scholarship. Many experts and historians of the Quran and of Quran manuscripts make the hypothesis that probably what the Islamic traditions say about the stability, very early stability of the text, perhaps very probably these narratives are historically correct. So although this aspect, it doesn't mean that this text has not been disseminated within a fragmentary way, like the other material, like prophetic traditions, for example, before and after its canonization. The Quran is commented, annotated from the very beginning, recited, collected, following various mediums with the context of, again, the circle of transmission. It has been written on various materials.
Asma, you need to start wrapping up now, please. You need to conclude, please.
Okay. I thought I have 40 minutes.
No, it's 45 minutes in total so that we have time for questions.
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry about that. How much do I have?
It's time for you to, if you could just say a few words in conclusion, please.
Okay. Okay. So actually, I was prepared to show you 3 passages where this fragmentariness I'm talking about is shown in early narratives, and more specifically in narratives about the very famous Battle of Siffin that took place in 657, and within the roles of the readers of the Quran, who showed that they shared somehow different material to study in order to make the arbitration between the 2 armies fair. So now I will end as I have to conclude, by showing you so a few examples of manuscripts that could be an evidence of what I'm talking about the annotation of Quran manuscripts. Here you see, for example, sorry, this is a manuscript from Museum of Islamic Art in Doha, in Qatar, dated of the 7th, 8th century. And you see here, I don't know if it's obvious to everyone, you see comments between two lines. Okay, and this is another very important Quran manuscript dated to the 9th century. Perhaps the date will be revised. That shows here a note on the margin. And this note on the margin is related to the call here after the word an-naqa in Arabic. So this call goes to the margin, and there is a comment here about something related to this word. Actually, it's a comment. Here you see it in detail, the call to the margin. Okay. Here you have another example from, again, the Museum of Islamic Art of Doha. Again, between the lines, another scribe than the one who wrote the page is commenting. Also, this part of it is in red ink. Another example from the Museum of Islamic Art within two inscriptions between, two remarks between the lines. This is an example from the Qayrawan collection with a comment by the same scribe between line 3 and line 4. This is the end of my examples. Thank you, and sorry about, excuse me about the misunderstanding. I thought I have much more time, but it's okay. I hope what I presented is allows to open a discussion and to share with you, I mean, concerns and reflection about how to teach the Quran. Thank you very much for your attention.
If you are with us in panel A, you please stay on with this link. And if you want to join panel B in the chat box, you can find the other link, or in the agenda, you can click the link to go to panel B, which is the parallel panel. Asma won't be able to chair this panel, so I would step in for now. I want to say how excited I am about the 3 presentations that are part of this panel. All 3 presentations, in my humble opinion, reading the abstracts, engaging something, are so relevant to the current debates that we are having in RE within UK and even across the world. All of these 3 presentations, I think, would be so relevant to the mainstream school teachers, but also the RE stakeholders and educators and the wider community who is trying to take the debate forward. Our first presentation today, I'm very happy and honored to introduce Kate and Lynn, who will be talking to us today about Islam as a worldview. And I think they have done some significant work in this area over the years, I must say. So without spending much more time, I would pass it on to Kate and Lynn. They would present for 20 minutes, and then we will have a Q&A for 10 minutes. And please feel free to put your questions or comments in the chat box that we can then pick it up. So over to you, Kate and Lynn.
Thank you so much, Fahim. Thanks, everyone, for coming to see us. My name is Kate. I'm a teacher, a high school teacher of RE. I teach in a school in East London. Lynn is a professor of education at the University of Christchurch, Canterbury. So we've been working together for about just over a year now. Generally speaking, we're concerned about teaching in RE generally. We find all of the teaching of the different worldviews reductive and therefore very much at risk of essentialization, decontextualized, utterly abstracted from any time and place and people, and therefore always open to problems of bias and problems of simple inaccuracy, as well as the problems of essentialization. And we both find, so we've argued this ourselves in our different ways, we both find this is especially true of teaching about Islam. I've actually put the title of Lynn's book in the chat, her 2012 book in the chat, if any of you want to have a look at that. Lynn explains in a lot more detail there. the real problems in teaching around Islam in schools, essentialized, abstracted, decontextualized, and so on. So our own work as a pair, as partners in crime, is with teachers. So what we do is we sort of try to triangulate 3 different elements. Firstly, the idea, so the more theoretical side of things, the idea of a critical contextual curriculum generally and applied to Islam in this project. So some educational theory there really. And then the practical exemplification. So again, in this case, the practical exemplification of what does it mean to teach as a worldview in the classroom. So practical resources for teachers to start to have a look at. And the third dimension that we're working with is teachers' own contexts in this educational and social context. Now, the 21st century, Britain, British RE or English RE, you might say. So we're trying to sort of make sense of and work in these 3 dimensions, the theoretical, the practical, and also where teachers are in their own context and where we are as a nation right now. And overall, our work is about understanding how Islam might be taught in the classroom. So we're on phase 1 of this project. Well, sorry, we just started phase 2. We've just finished phase 1 of the project. Phase 1 was about 18 months of work. We'll talk a bit more about this in this session. And we're moving into phase 2, which again, we'll talk a little bit more about. But through this first year of work and working in these 3 dimensions with teachers, we've come to develop 2 working principles for teaching Islam in the classroom. And so we'll explore these a little bit in this session. So our first principle is that worldview starts with people. And our second principle is that pupils have to engage with different types of knowledge. They have to critically engage with knowledge as part of their growing understanding. So our first principle then, worldview starts with people, is actually quite a powerful and simple measure to guard against abstraction and essentialism and inaccuracy and bias or stereotypes. And Lynn will talk in a lot more detail about this in a minute. And our second principle, that pupils need to engage with the knowledge itself and the way it's framed and the questions that can be asked in the way the knowledge is framed, that also allows such a rich and much more diverse set of questions to be asked in the classroom and conversations to be had in the classroom. So that was a short introduction. I'm going to hand over to Lynn now, and she's going to talk in a bit more detail about these 2 principles. Lynn's going to next slide me. I think we're starting here. Yes, Lynn?
Thank you.
Thanks.
So just picking up from what Kate was saying, our starting point was the limitations and the very restricted nature of RE as it exists at the moment, where the common theme is the essentialization of the 6 major world religions. I mean, even the fact that we talk about 6 major world religions is obviously an essentializing factor. So just to give you an example, if you look at work which is commonly produced around the mosque, we did a survey of the first 100 resources produced on the Times Educational Supplement resource list. These are resources that are commonly used by teachers, but actually if you go back and look at all the key textbooks, you will find work like this, where mosques are presented as ahistorical, geographical buildings, places without time, without history. It's very, very rare to even have a mosque named, let alone giving any kind of geographical context. And what we wanted to do was start from a position. If we started from people, we would be able to ask questions about the mosque, which were completely revelatory compared to what went before. So we would be able to talk about, who are the people in the mosque? Why are they there? What are their particular beliefs? How do they differ generationally? So the mosque that we've got a picture up of there is the mosque in Gillingham, which is a small town near where I live in the south of England. As you can see, it's a converted house. It's most of the people that attend are first, second, third generation Sunni Muslims of Pakistani heritage. And although it's a relatively small mosque, there are lots of different stories inside this mosque, which give a great richness to understanding this particular Muslim community. So we know that there are real differences in the interpretation of Islam, in terms of a liberal sense, in terms of questions around the place of family and of women, even within this one particular mosque. So it is really important for us to be able to understand those contexts. And we believe that if we start with people, then that will allow us to ask different kinds of questions. Next slide, Kate, please. It also allows us to look at Islam as a historical phenomena. So we just use this picture as a photograph, as a prompt of women outside a mosque in Egypt in the 50s. You know, there are so many different types of questions you could begin to explore in the classroom. Why are they dressed in the way that they are? What was their relationship to the mosque? What was their relationship to one another? Do you go to the next slide? Thank you. And what we did is we've developed resources and work around the mosque movement, the women's mosque movement in Egypt, as a way of encouraging teachers and pupils to be able to explore not just the nature of the mosque, but the fact that different Muslims at different periods of time and history have a different relationship with the mosque. So I'm sure that most people here today will know the background to the mosque movement, the fact that women up and down Egypt in lots of different contexts began to organize themselves around discussing what it meant to be a Muslim woman, what it meant to understand and live an Islamic life in their own particular familial context. But what is really important for us is that if we start with people, it allows us to ask these questions. But if we combine it with the other point which Kate talked about, which is disciplinary knowledge, that allows us to ask not just broader questions, but questions of an entirely different nature. So people that are familiar with RE, as it exists in the moment, know that one of the tropes that we have in religious education is that we ask children to learn about and we ask children to learn from. But listening to Asma this morning and her fantastic keynote, one of the things that struck me was, which is something that we'd already begun, Kate and I've already begun to reflect on, is that rather than asking children or pupils just to reflect on themselves, what about if we ask them to reflect on scholarship? If we ask them to reflect on different academic questions and different bodies of knowledge, that opens up a critical perspective in the study of religion, and it also opens up a whole world of interpretation which previously RE hadn't allowed us. So the picture that we've got up on the screen at the moment is the brand new mosque, it doesn't exist yet, that has been envisioned by the Muslim community at the Gillingham Mosque that I showed you earlier. You know, this is the mosque that they would love to build in their dreams. But it's caused a huge amount of controversy in Gillingham because people don't want such a large and blatant Muslim statement in the centre of Gillingham. People feel that it's too loud a Muslim voice. And you know, what a fantastic perspective to share with young people in terms of the study of Islam, looking at, you know, using a geographical lens in terms of physical spaces inside cities, using a citizenship education lens in terms of looking at people's rights and the idea of protest and media courage. So for us, it is that twin, the bringing together of those twin points, the engagement with knowledge and starting with people, that makes a worldviews approach to Islam so exciting. Over to you, Kate.
Sorry, thanks, Lynn. Yeah, I'm actually looking at the chat and getting myself completely distracted. If anybody wants to look at these actual resources that we've developed for the classroom, if you want to just, I guess if you just want to email me put in the chat your email addresses. That's probably the easiest thing. It's a series of lessons. In fact, I'm rather handily sharing this screen now. So for Key Stage 1, we developed this set of lessons around Rumi, the poet Rumi, and the idea of dragons, which is actually looking at different dragons, different artistic representations of dragons. Is actually a really quite easy and rather lovely way to introduce young children to the idea of geographical and cultural diversity across, you know, the whole of the Islamic world. Key Stage 2 to 3, we developed some resources on Muhammad Ali the man, and many contexts that he navigated in his life, which the pupils also have to make sense of themselves. And Key Stage 3 to 4, we developed some resources around the idea of the mosque, the idea of freedom of speech, and then also some stuff on Malala Yousafzai, which is probably more of a Key Stage 4 level, although if it's not in the GCSE, it's probably going to be taught to Key Stage 3. So Lynn's sort of expanded a little bit on some of the ideas that we've been looking at. So for us, the idea of the religion and worldviews agenda came at an opportune time. I'm not sure if you know, how many of you know so much about that. You might not be completely obsessed with the RE curriculum in England as I am. But this is an agenda arguing that the subject really, really needs to shift its frame of reference, to embrace context, to embrace plurality, to embrace diversity and messiness and overlap and non-religious worldviews that might well be held by religious people. So this came along at a really good time. We kind of jumped on that bandwagon a little bit because teachers were interested, teachers were listening and looking around for something that could help frame their thoughts. This is hence the title, Islam as a Worldview. And teachers have been interested. We've had some fantastic conversations. So as I said, we've finished phase 1 now, which is the production of these sets of resources for teachers and some CPD workshops, we call them. So some engaging teachers in conversations about the wider thinking, the theoretical work, the practical examples, and then how this works in their own context. And we're constantly trying to triangulate these 3 dimensions. So in the first phase, we had some really interesting conversations. For example, our Muhammad Ali resources really went down a storm. We don't just learn about him as a Muslim, we learn about him as a boxer. The first lesson is about boxing, actually. We don't even go anywhere near Islam, apart from the very last minute of the lesson, where he actually, having won his heavyweight fight in, I think, 1963, he's known then as Cassius Clay. He actually has already become a Muslim, converted or reverted to Islam, and he's become known as Muhammad Ali. That's when he announces it to the world stage. This is my name. This is how I want you to talk about me. So we look at him as a boxer. We look at Muhammad Ali as a conscientious objector. He refused to fight in the Vietnam War. We look at him as a sort of anti-racist activist, really, and as a Muslim man. Islam was a heart of his life. But he also went on a journey within his faith. He initially was a part of the Nation of Islam. Then after some time, that just wasn't really working for him. And so he moved on to the Sufi path and was on that for a long time, and ultimately ended his life on a more sort of mainstream Sunni path within his faith. So we don't just look at him as a Muslim isolated from his life. We look at all the political contexts that Muhammad Ali himself was navigating, but we also acknowledge that as a Muslim man, he also changed his mind over his lifetime, and he was also on a journey within his faith. So that went down a storm, that particular set of lessons. But then at the end of those conversations, teachers would often say, but what about the core knowledge? How will the pupils get the core knowledge from this? You know, the mosque, the Quran, the main beliefs. And we felt through that, I think the whole of the first phase, we had many conversations with teachers. We felt we didn't ever quite come to a satisfactory answer for ourselves and for our teachers. What we really wanted to say was, forget the core knowledge. It's imposed, or it's come from a world religions approach, which is maybe looking through an Anglican or a Protestant Christian lens at all the world faiths, or all 6 of the world faiths. You know, the Protestant Christianity has the Bible occupying a particular position in the tradition, and so therefore, is that tradition, is it the same in Islam for the Quran? Protestant Christianity has priests and churches. What's the equivalent in Islam? Is it imams and mosques? Well, not really. So I think our concern really is what we might call core knowledge under the world religions approach is not necessarily authentic to Islam at all, or Islams at all. So I guess we're looking for sort of authenticity that we can still bring to the classroom in simple forms that teachers can work with. However, now we're into phase 2, we're finding our conversations, I suppose this is iterative thinking, isn't it? We're now finding the whole core knowledge thing was a bit of a red herring. It's not about core knowledge. It's about how pupils and teachers engage with knowledge. So if I actually go back to these set of questions, oh, I can't seem to go back. Oh, there it is. These sorts of questions. So this is a question about town planning as much as anything, isn't it? Is there parking for this new Islamic centre? And it's also a question about the very particular context of a Medway town in England in the 21st century. What are voices in support? What are voices just really in questioning? What are voices against a large and rather beautiful Islamic centre in their town? So these sorts of questions, that if you engage with knowledge in a more disciplinary way, you allow so many rich and more, I guess, authentic questions to be asked in the classroom. So this is where we are right now, beginning our phase 2. We're working with teachers, again, to produce practical resources. We always want to be producing practical resources that other teachers can then try and work with. We're working much more within teachers' own context now, so it's really drawn from some particular classroom settings. And then we render some more experimental, provisional teaching ideas that other teachers can work with. We found our 2 principles. Worldview starts with people, and pupils have to engage with the knowledge to be simple and powerful and effective. And we're generally feeling quite excited about the potential of this project in empowering teachers to see themselves as professionals with an enormous amount of professional autonomy, as they are the curriculum creators of the future. That's the end of our presentation. Thank you for listening.
Saturday afternoon. I hope those who are with us this morning had some lunch break and coming back with renewed energies. I want to welcome you for panel 2A. And if you would like to join panel 2B, there is a link in the chat box where the parallel panel, you can join that. The 3 presentations in this panel today we have are quite relevant to the classroom case studies that are part of the conference. So a type of presentation in the conference are paper presentations, and other are classroom case studies. And I hope that these 3 presenters will bring some cases from the field. So it's not just top down, but it's bottom up in some ways. And we get to listen to their work that they have done in this area. The first presentation that we have today is from Shabnam Khalik, and the title of this presentation is An Anthropological Lens to Ari, Understanding the Last Sermon of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Shabnam, over to you for this presentation.
Thank you very much. And I'll make a quick start just because I don't want to go over the time. So just very quickly, like Fahim has said, I'm classroom based. I'm not somebody who comes from a scholarship background. I am very much classroom based, and a lot of what I'm going to talk to you about comes through my experiences of the classroom, and also a lot of it is comes through my own sort of journey within Islam, and Islam is one of those religions where even when you were born into it, you actually never stop learning, and I'm certainly somebody who has found that. So a lot of what I will talk to you is a combination of the two, what I'm learning myself as a Muslim and my experiences within the classroom, and I do hope that I sort of present a light of Islam that is helpful to you in whatever sphere you are in. So very quickly, I'm moving on. Before we start looking at using anthropology within the classroom, it's really important that we actually understand what anthropology is. And most anthropologists would argue that we are all anthropologists, in that we have an interest in how people live their lives and why people live their lives. And in its most basic form, anthropology is the study of human beings in the past and how that's impacted us in the now, and the study of human beings in the now. Anthropology does have a number of branches, but for us in the RE classroom, what I found really useful is using social and cultural anthropology. When we are teaching RE, then for me, anthropology is so vital, because one of the things that we need to understand when we are teaching world faiths is they don't exist within a vacuum, and certainly Islam wasn't delivered or revealed even in a vacuum. It was revealed within a social context, and when we get revelations that we teach in our classroom, and when we get revelations in Islam, these are responses to a social setting. These are responses to a society at the time. So it's really important that we make that clear to the kids in our classroom when we are teaching. We also have to remember as well that what anthropology allows us to do, and I think Kate and Lynn touched upon this in the morning, it allows us to put faces to ideas and beliefs, and really allows us to bring beliefs to life, which I think is paramount for us as teachers to do. And ultimately, and I love this quote that you can see on your screen, it's a way of seeing under the surface, because when we are teaching within religious education, what we're trying to do is get under that surface as much as we possibly can to really understand people and the beliefs that they might have. And I'm hoping that in this session, that's what I will be able to do with you this afternoon. Very quickly then, I will touch upon this idea of lenses, and I'm not going to go into this in a lot of detail because there is a lot of work done by people that have way more knowledge on this than I do, and I do recommend, if you haven't already done so, if you want to get an understanding of lenses within an RE classroom, I do recommend reading the work by Dawn Cox. She's got a blog on it, and the book written by Louise and Dawn also sheds light on using lenses and the different lenses that you can use in a classroom when you are teaching RE. And ultimately what we're trying to do when we're using these different lenses is get to the misconceptions that learners in our classroom might have. And if you think about our RE classrooms across the country, they are so vast and diverse. If I talk to you a little bit about mine, I teach in inner city Bradford, and a lot of my kids come from a Sunni Muslim Pakistani background. If I look at my RE class, everybody comes from that background. And the misconceptions that they have might be very different to the ones the kids in your classrooms might have. But that being said, they do have misconceptions, and they have them because religions are living amongst us, and the kids see it. They don't have to wait into our class to come to our classrooms before they have sort of their first experience with religion. They're seeing religion, they're hearing religion, some of them are part of them, they're feeling them, they see it on social media. So there are misconceptions that our students have before they come into our classrooms, and what the lenses approach allows you to do is really identify what those misconceptions are and really get to the bottom of some of those misconceptions. So what I'm going to focus on today is the final sermon of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And the final sermon has significance within Islam because it was sort of the final bits of teaching that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, gave. And it's really important that we understand the final sermon before we begin teaching it. I have seen a number of curriculums where the final sermon is being taught. And for me personally, in my own experience of teaching it, what I found was I was teaching it without context. And I will give you an example of teaching it without context and the misconceptions that students have when we mention the final sermon. So the final sermon takes place during the Hajj that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, performs in the year 632. And again, Hajj is something that we teach as part of the Gcse curriculum, and a lot of people teach it as part of Key Stage 3. So it's really significant for Muslims, and a lot of them will know the final sermon. So even if you're not teaching it, and you've got Muslim kids in your classroom, a lot of them will know the final sermon because of the significance it has within Islam. When Muslims will attend the Friday prayer, a lot of the time the sermon that is delivered in Friday prayer mirrors a final sermon. You might have kids in your classroom that know it in Arabic, you might have kids in your classroom that know it in English, that have got a real understanding of the words of the final sermon. And again, this comes back to the misconceptions that kids might have when they look at when you look at the final sermon. Why else is it really important? Because it is the last time that the Prophet, or one of the last times that the Prophet Muhammad speaks to an audience of people. So when he announces that he's going to perform the Hajj, there are 100,000 Sahaba, so people that seen the Prophet at the time, that also attend. And he makes it very clear that this is the last time that he might see them in such a capacity. I mean, the starting of the sermon, he says, this might be the last time I see you. I don't know if we will gather like this again. He asks them, have I delivered my message to you? And for a lot of scholars, that is him cleansing his soul before he departs this earth, because he wants them to testify that he has delivered the message. So again, just to reiterate that point, it is very significant for Muslims and for the Muslim students that you might have in your classroom. Now, unfortunately, in this session, I won't be able to go over every single part of the final sermon, but I am going to focus on three main parts of it. The teachings around wealth. I want to just quickly focus on that. I want to focus again on the teachings around women, and then I won't have time, but I do want to touch upon the teachings around brotherhood. And the reason why I do that is because I want to illustrate with you an example of a misconception that students might have. When we taught the final sermon, but when I taught the final sermon, if you just go back to what I've said about my classroom, I teach predominantly Sunni Muslims, and I remember when I taught the final sermon, and we literally just read it together, and I didn't really break it down, and I didn't consider that I would have to provide the social context of the final sermon. And when I spoke about one brotherhood, one of my students said, the Prophet wasn't referring to Shia Muslims, miss. He was only referring to Sunni Muslims. And that's what made me stop and think, wait, actually, hold on. First of all, the kids know this in a lot of detail. And second, they've got misconceptions about the final sermon. And again, it comes back to making sure that we are addressing the needs of those kids in our classroom and making sure that we are addressing the misconceptions that they might have. Very quickly then, I'm going to go on to the first teaching from the final sermon and the issues around wealth, and this idea that religions are not sort of revealed in a vacuum, and they are responding to the context of that time. So inequality in pre-Islamic Arabia did exist, and there was an Arab slave trade that existed, and the gulf between the rich and poor was huge. You had people that were really wealthy, and then you had those people that had absolutely nothing. And in the final sermon, when the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, mentions interest, he is mentioning that gulf between the rich and the poor. And it's really important that we understand and we teach that existed in pre-Islamic Arabia. And when he mentions the use of interest, he also names his own uncle at the time. And many scholars say the reason why he did that is because he was demonstrating that inequality is the responsibility of every single Muslim that exists. And we do have within Islam principles around the economy that we must sort of adhere to. So when we teach zakah then, and again, it's one of the 5 pillars of Islam that we teach, one of the questions that I want you to sort of reflect upon is, do you teach the principles around the economy, and do you teach the principles around wealth and sort of just money when you are teaching zakah? Because we know what it is, and Edward sort of mentioned the misconceptions that textbooks might have, but when we're teaching it to our kids, do we then go into a little bit of detail as to, first of all, why are Muslims told that they must pay zakah? What is the purpose of it, and what was happening at the time that when this revelation came out, and do we teach the principles around wealth and the acquisition of wealth? If I just quickly share with you then those principles around the acquisition of wealth. In Islam, having too much and having too little are seen as roads to disbelief. And there's a story in Islam where Umar, one of the caliphs of the Prophet, says, if poverty was a man, I would have choked him with my own hands, because it is a road to disbelief. And for Muslims, it is absolutely vital that we are ensuring that we are not in positions where we have too much, but also we are ensuring that people around us don't have or do have something, and they're not living in absolute poverty. And then again, when we're teaching zakah, one of the second principles around it is this idea that money should rest in your hands. So you should have money. And Islam is one of the religions in Islam, in one of the monotheistic faiths, that does not really promote a day of rest. So when we look at the holy day, which is Friday, Muslims are taught to stop trading at the point of the adhan for Friday prayer, but after Friday prayer they can disperse into the lands and they can continue trading. So we know that acquiring wealth and earning money, there is a space for that in Islam, but we are told that the money shouldn't have a place in your heart. It shouldn't reside in your heart. What it should do is just have a place in your hand, and that is it. And then for Muslims, what zakah does, that third principle, what it is actually doing is, by paying zakah, what you are doing is you are showing your absolute trust in God. Because what human beings psychologically, what we're doing when we're holding on to wealth is we're not thinking about right now, this moment. We're planning for the future, aren't we? We're thinking about what is, in 10 years time I might need this, or in 15 years time my kids might need to buy a house, I'm going to need this wealth. Actually, what we should be doing is putting our faith in Allah, and zakat is one of those tests of faith. Are we putting our faith in Allah, or are we just going to continuously be attached to this money? Because we have to trust that Allah ultimately is going to provide, and all wealth for Muslims does come from Allah, and that is sort of what zakat is, and that's one of the principles around wealth in Islam. And it's actually really important that we are teaching our kids that context behind it, other than adding to the fact that it is just money that is given, that is used to help the poor. Then just quickly moving on, because I know we're going to run out of time, I do want to touch upon the second teaching that was on one of my slides, which was the treatment of women. And I think this is really, really important when we look at, number one, current day understanding of Muslim women, when we look at sort of the understanding of the cultural understanding that people might have of Muslim women. If you look at pre-Islamic Arabia, then we know that there was sort of a gap in the way women were treated. They were seen as, for certain women, certainly those women that were poorer, they were seen to be inferior to men. And we know that in pre-Islamic Arabia there was female infanticide existed. We know that women didn't have the rights of divorce. We know that there was rights taken away from women when it came to marriage. They didn't have a choice over who they were going to marry. Lots of girls were given away before they hit the age of puberty. But what we also need to do is ensure that we do recognise and we do show and speak about those women in pre-Islamic Arabia that did not fit this mould. And one of the women that I want to talk to you about is Nafisa Bin Al-Hassan, and she was actually a companion of the Prophet. And again, just inviting you to a discussion from my classroom. When we started teaching prophethood, one of the girls in my class said, why in Islam, if it's a religion of equality and we say that men and women are equal, why in Islam is there no male prophets, and why in Islam is there no companions who are male? And actually, that again, it's a misconception, because there were female companions of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And one of the things that we try and do is teach these so that our kids understand that. And Nafisa Bin Al-Hassan was one of them. And if you read the book, The Great Women of Islam, her life is documented in a lot of detail. And she was somebody who was out in the sort of public sphere at the time of Prophet Muhammad. If you look at the Battle of Uhud, she's somebody who fought, and she's somebody that the Prophet Muhammad spoke about and said, everywhere I turned, she was there and she was protecting me. She is somebody who is very, very courageous, and he asks her, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, asks her about her courage and says, where can somebody get courage in the way that you have courage? And she asks him very openly and says, how come Allah only speaks about men in the Quran? When we get revelations, Allah is only speaking to men in the Quran. And remember, one of the things that I said, the revelations are not coming down to us in a vacuum. They are responses to things that are happening at the time. And when she asks that question, we do get a revelation that includes women in the Quran. And Allah does... Okay, thank you. Allah does respond, and he does show that men and women are equal and that they do have a space. And it's that teaching there in Surah 35. Now, I know, again, that surah is something that is a part of our spec when we are teaching GCSE. And the question that, again, I'm asking you is, do you teach this quote from the anthropological lens? Are you shedding light on why this quote was revealed and why it's even there? And then the second person that I'm going to just quickly touch upon is a person called Nafisa Bin Al-Hassan. And she, again, is really, really important when we're teaching Islam, and particularly when we teach sects of Islam, because she is a scholar, and she is a scholar that is the person that taught Imam Shafi. And in Islam, what we have is you have, particularly in Sunni Islam, you have 4 schools of thought. And Imam Shafi is the theologian behind one school of thought. And his teacher is a woman, and she's called Nafisa Bin Al-Hassan, and she has a really prominent role in his understanding of Islam, in his interpretation of Islam, and his theological perspective of Islam. And often these types of women we don't teach, and particularly when we look at the Shafi school of thought, that's somebody that we sort of tend to forget. I know in the conversations that I've had with the kids that I teach, in the conversations that I've had with my family, lots of people haven't known that. Lots of people haven't known that actually the person behind Imam Shafi, behind that school of thought, is a woman. And the reason why I'm touching upon sects and this idea of one brotherhood is Islam does have sects. There are sects in Islam that exist, and there are schools of thought in Islam that exist. And one of the things that I'm working on at the moment is how we try and get that as best as we can into classrooms. Because despite all of that, we are described as one brotherhood. And if I take you back to that conversation with that one student that I've had, in his mind, we are not one brotherhood. And when the Prophet Muhammad is talking about one brotherhood, he's only talking about one type of Muslim. And we do have to look at how, first of all, we brush up our own knowledge on these ideas and then tackle those misconceptions that students might have. And then very quickly, I'm going to end with a quote that I absolutely love. And I'm just going to ask you to, if you haven't already, to read the very, very short blog by Nikki McGee, which is Knowledge is Power, because ultimately that's what we are trying to do. We're trying to ensure that our kids have a curriculum that is a rich source of knowledge. And I think anthropology really allows you to do that, because like I said in the beginning, what it allows you to do is dig beneath the surface and understand the social context of the time that it was revealed.
Sure, thank you, Fahim, very much. And that was a lovely presentation, Shabnam. I really enjoyed it. Okay, so let me just get started. So hello, everyone. My name is Farah, and I'll be speaking to you today about, as Fahim just mentioned, teaching RE using artifacts, engaging with material culture. So just to go over the flow of the presentation, I'll share a little bit first about my role, background, and context, so you can learn a little bit about me, where I work. And then I will aim to situate the study for you and what I'll be speaking about. I'll share some insights from the literature. I want to make a note about RE curriculum in general, especially within the British context, and then the type, and then the type that we also use and our teachers end up teaching. Then I will share the pedagogical approach to teaching RE using artifacts. I'll share an approach with you through an experience, an educational experience we created where we took students to the museum, the British Museum specifically. And then I'll share maybe some alternative approaches, if time, as to how, if a museum is not available, how you can still bring it alive, this idea of teaching through artifacts in the classroom. Then I will conclude with some challenges of using this approach, as well as the overall benefits and highlights and the richness that it does offer us. So just a little bit about me. I'm currently employed at the Institute of Ismaili Studies in the Department of Graduate Studies. I work within the STEP program, the Secondary Teacher Education Program. As a part of this program, we offer 2 degrees to our students, an MA in Islamic Studies and a postgraduate diploma, which is in partnership with SOAS University and UCL respectively. In this role, I have a number of responsibilities, both academic and administrative. Among these responsibilities, one is to teach classes, conduct seminars, tutorials, lead professional learning communities, provide feedback on lessons, and train, mentor, and guide our teacher trainees in becoming the best educators they can possibly be and to continue growing in their practice. The interesting thing about this as well is that nearly a decade ago, I actually attended the IIS as a student myself, and I was enrolled in the same program. So I myself have the teaching experience that the students I now teach, mentor, and guide are working towards. And I actually feel very privileged as well as humbled to be on the same panel as one of my previous students who has in fact graduated from the program and is now teaching in her home country as well. So that's just a little bit about me. So now I want to situate the study for you. So I will be speaking to the learning experience that we designed for students. Essentially, this learning experience that we designed was grounded in the curriculum narratives and learning objectives of the textbook that we use, that teachers use to teach adolescent youth. And I'll show you that a little bit later on. We'll speak a little bit more about that. But the study essentially demonstrates how by designing a learning experience that goes beyond the classroom via a visit to the British Museum, it can serve to enhance students' learning in powerful and transformative ways. Through this experience, students see through artifacts how Islam has inspired Muslims and how Islam itself can be explored as both a faith and as an inspiration to peoples, societies, and civilizations. Ultimately, such an approach to teaching allows us to go beyond teaching Islam from solely a religious studies point of view, and instead serves to enhance, to re-envision, and enhance a multifaceted understanding of Islamic civilization and its peoples. And I have included here Muslim and non-Muslim because we had a whole host of diversity living amongst these societies and civilizations, both in the past and in the present day. And this is how we can also situate it as an integral part of world history. So some literary insights from a conference presentation that Dr. Qasim delivered several years ago. She poses a question. She asks, what happens to Islam when it is taught from the religious studies point of view? So she argues, theoretically speaking, the field of religious studies does not have a single methodological approach. It actually encourages multidisciplinary, cross-cultural, and historical approaches to religious phenomena. Yet when we examine typical textbooks used in entry-level religion courses, it is evident that there are 2 ways in which the religion is approached. The first is through dimensions of faith, and the second is through world religions. She argues both approaches tend to work against historically situated understandings and instead encourage a static, descriptive view of religions. These approaches persist because they offer, she offers a reason, because they offer an accessible rubric for cross-cultural and topical religious courses. So for instance, the appeal of teaching Buddhism through the 4 Noble Truths or Islam through the 5 Pillars is immense and all too common. So just a few notes on the curriculum then. The Gcse Curriculum, these are some images I captured I want us to, if I can ask us to just pay attention to the images we see on these covers, the titles of the books, and to just imagine, what we think might be present in the book, in the text itself, or what do we think we will read about or learn about, just from the cover alone, from the language, the titles, the subheadings alone. And I'm asking us to do this because it relates to the next slide where I have put some arguments forward by Shahab Ahmed, who in his book, What is Islam?, provoked debate and significantly altered our understanding of Islam. Essentially, in his text, he challenges dominant understandings grounded in the categories of religion and culture, or those that privilege law and scripture alone. He argues that these modes of thinking actually obstruct us from understanding Islam. And in fact, what they do is they distort it, they diminish it, and they render it incoherent. So he essentially argues that it critically impairs our ability to recognize the central and crucial aspects of the historical reality that Islam is and what it offers. And he tries to put forward his well, he does successfully put forward an argument in his entire book where he tries to argue for teaching Islam or learning about Islam or studying Islam as a real historical phenomenon, and to do it in a way that allows for complexity, coherence, as well as contradiction, because it's just very complex. It's not as simple and cut and dried as we may have been told, or we may do a simple search and see what Islam is about. So I want to now just make a bit of a comparison here, or share with you as well some of the curriculum that we teach that have been developed by the Institute of Ismaili Studies, and just a brief comparison, as we look at the titles of these texts or the images on the front covers of these books. What are we seeing? What is it depicting? What kind of language is being used? I mean, right off the bat, we see that the idea of plurality is definitely acknowledged. The fact that the study of Islam is not confined to any one particular geographical or cultural region of the world, of the Muslim world. The idea of encounters in plural in Muslim history, or the idea of various types of literature that emerges from different places, time periods, thinkers, scholars, poets, literary figures, etc. The notion of even just this title, the Quran and its interpretations, acknowledging that there is a wide spectrum of believers and beliefs and perhaps beliefs may be common, but the interpretations differ. And the acknowledgement is present in these texts. And when you look at the images as well, we don't really see human beings, but we see art, we see architecture, we see things that are not often depicted or shown to us or expressed when we research Islam or see what's on the media or news about Islam. So it really shows an aesthetic side, a humanistic side, a civilizational side as well. So using this curriculum then, I will now go into an approach that the educational experience that was designed for students, teaching RE using artifacts. So just to show you a bit of table of contents as to how these themes are organized in the text. Here we have various dynasties, and the way in which they're taught to students is through culture, through development, through the finding of a caliphate, learning and culture, the flowering of it, the rise and the fall of dynasties. So there's an ethical kind of component as well that is present. And here's another text. And I show you these two because they inform the visit that we took our students on. So before we even took the students to the museum, we had them do a pre-task. And the pre-task was for them to go onto the website. And what's great about the British Museum is that all the details are already present on the site. So students are able to see what they might come across when they visit the museum. They get a whole host of knowledge, information about the time period, what it is, the vast spectrum of artifacts that are on display at the museum. So we ask them before they even visit to select one object that interests them just by looking on the website, and to try and find it when they visit the museum. So there's a connector point there. We then ask them to note details that are provided to them on the website about the artifact itself. And just as a point of reference, if they find this interesting, they can compare this as well with how it is represented at the museum. Because I think representations, as we may have seen, can also provide simplistic forms of expression, or really complex and dynamic and grounded in actual narratives. So we can ask them to compare it as well, or to compare it with other galleries and how artifacts are put on display. And then the third is, this could be a post-visit reflection as well. What is the difference between seeing an artifact online and in person? So this was a museum pre-task. Now, once they had done that, which was about a few days before the actual visit, when we took them to the actual museum, we gave them some time. We paired them up. We gave them some time to freely walk through the gallery and to find 2 artifacts that appeal to them personally. So there's a personal connection at play. That could be something that catches their eye, their interest, their intrigue, their curiosity. We then ask them to find out more about the artifact. What are its features? Where was it made? What is its historical context? Are there inscriptions? Can they see something in person that they were unable to see online, for instance? And to, again, ask themselves, what is so intriguing about this piece? Another option could be for them to sketch the artifact if there is time for them to do so, and or take a photo of it for reference. As we ask them to take note, and some of the things I've listed here, really just try to highlight some of the more critical aspects of learning through artifacts. So asking them about the context, asking them, in a previous session, we would have gone through observation techniques as to how they can view, look at, what sort of details they want to use to lenses by which they can examine their artifact. So there's skills involved as well. And then a bit of meaning making and interpretation and analysis is at play in the last 2 questions, which is, what does it tell you about the society, the expression of faith, or the people of that time? So really bringing it to the ground level, and showing students that, this is something people created. This is something people engage with. This is something people used. And then to see what humanistic or civilizational themes they may see emerging from the artifact. Because, sometimes these artifacts go to show us that even though it was created or, featured in the Fatimid era, it has linkages to people from China. Or visions, for instance, the one in the middle has lotuses on it, which is an Asian influence. So the cross-cultural referencing can also emerge when they engage with the artifacts and analyze it in the way that they are, but also see it with their own eyes. And then, so post-task, so once we've gone through that experience, there's a couple of questions we could use to engage in a discussion with the students. So I've kind of separated these into 3 categories, but they don't have to be separated in these categories. And they don't all have to be asked at the same time either. It really depends on what the intention is of the visit and the exercise and the objectives or learning outcomes of the lesson. But so the first 2 questions really kind of speak to this inclusive sort of idea in terms of what values do you see represented in these societies through these artifacts? What artifacts from these societies, dynasties, and civilizations, what do they reveal to us about people's lives at that time? And then the Muslim-specific questions, so really asking about the engagement with Muslims themselves, how they encountered, interacted with different civilizations, what it tells us about the relationship, not just with the divine, but also with others, the world, their lifestyle, and the environment they live within. Reflecting on the inspiration that Muslims may have received from the faith of Islam, emerging from the creation itself. and how they have used this inspiration to interact with and shape the world around them. So really seeing them as agents of change as well. And then the last one is really inspired by Shahab's book, where, and this could be maybe for more advanced level students, where, the questions of what observations now can we make about Islam as a real historical phenomenon from this visit, from these artifacts, and what have you discovered about Islam as a theoretical object or analytical category through the artifacts themselves. So this would be the museum visit itself. I don't know how I'm doing for time, Fahim.
For 2 more minutes, yeah.
Thank you. So this could be an actual visit to the museum. Here are some alternative approaches also emerging from our curriculum, which can take place in the classroom itself. So researching artifacts, creating some kind of gallery, students taking on the role of a historian or an archaeologist, anthropologist. They could compose an autobiography of a book, for instance, and use artifacts to make inferences about lives of people from the past. Here is another way in which to bring it forth. These artifacts are from the Louvre Museum. And some questions, some analytical questions that can be used to engage from much deeper layers. More in analytical questions, as well as how they can present it to the students or the class itself, perhaps even for assessment. I'll just quickly go over the challenges. So, we can look at the term artifact and see it as what Hohmann terms as dead culture, rather than the lived reality. He goes into a bit of analysis here and puts forward 2 perspectives offered by both Michael and Nick, Michael Gove and Nick Gibb. I won't go over these details, but what I can say is that, James Holt, who is associate professor, says that that these 2 miss the point about the purpose of RE, because what they do is they recognize the value, but they do so on the basis of a flawed assumption. And the assumption is that RE's greatest contribution is to help people understand culture, history, and countries. But if RE is pursued on that basis alone, then it becomes a purely academic exercise with no attempt to understand people. And for the most part, with no attempt to make it relevant to the students' own experiences. In this sense, then, if we leave things to the level of it being just knowledge focused alone, there would be something amiss, which is what he's trying to say. And there's also a point here about the use of the term artifact. If we do use the term artifact, we need to be prepared to explain what we mean by it, especially if, this point about it being dead culture is brought forward or put into the minds of people. So he says, if we're not going to use it, then what terminology is available to us? And here are just a list of other ways in which we can speak about it. Objects of devotion or devotional objects, objects used in devotion or worship, perhaps the name of the object itself, like the mosque lamp or the bowl or the tombstone, to allow for a wide spectrum of objects to be seen and acknowledged. And or objects, that are used to illustrate, but which may not be religious or sacred in and of themselves, but can therefore be described as paintings, pictures, sculptures, etc. And just very quickly, the benefits, which is the last slide. Truly, if we do take this type of approach, it does attempt to balance the recorded histories of the period, which often concentrate on the rulers and the elites, with inferences about the lives of ordinary people. It can also help students to understand how artifacts and material culture can be used as sources of history, and to explore the impact of different innovations on later civilizations. When the students engage in this exercise and then present, the choices that they decide on, along with their explanations, can illuminate the great diversity that exists in their own way, in their own words, which favors a broad and balanced approach to the subject matter as well. It also helps students develop historical thinking skills. Yeah, so thank you. That is it.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, it's a bit faded. You might have to speak a bit loud, but we can.
Now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. So, hello everyone, and my name is Ravina Noordin, and I hope you guys are enjoying this conference presentation. And in today's conference presentation, I'm going to talk about how can we teach the artistic culture of a civilization. And in this presentation, I'm basically going to talk about, so what we are trying to see here in this presentation, we are trying to understand how religious diversity and complexity could be incorporated in our classroom through art. And how we are going to achieve this goal, we are first going to study about the aims of RE, that what the curriculum is trying to achieve. Secondly, we are going to see where are the gaps. So the curriculum wants to achieve something, but are there any gaps, and where are those? What are those gaps? And thirdly, we are going to see how these gaps can be minimized by incorporating art in our classroom. And here I'm going to share some of the examples that can be used in the RE classrooms of UK class setup, and one of my classroom example as well, where I ask my students to explore the artistic culture of partner civilization. Lastly, we are going to discuss about the possible outcomes that we are trying to achieve by incorporating arts in our classroom. And of course, no strategy is foolproof without any challenges. So let's see what those challenges could be. So what RE curriculum is trying to achieve? Well, there are many aims that the RE curriculum is trying to achieve. However, I am highlighting few of those for today's discussion. And one of them is that we are providing students with a tool so that they could engage with the RE education, so that they could live in a society that is pluralistic and appreciate and appraise the nature and significance of others' religious beliefs, culture, and practices. And when we are trying to achieve all of these things in our RE classroom, in our RE curriculum, however, at the same time, when we look at how Islam has been presented in those curriculum, I would say that, and even with the help of the literature, we would say that it's monolithic presentation. When I say monolithic presentation, I mean that most of the curriculum deals with the Sunni understanding of Islam. And even within the Sunni understanding of Islam, it is dealing with one or few sect of the Sunni group. Secondly, even when it is talking about the Shia beliefs, it is rather talking about the Khalid Shia beliefs rather than other groups. And the dress code. So in most in the RE curriculum books that I observed for this presentation, depicted women and men as women with the hijab and man with the cap and wearing shalwar kurta. However, what we are missing is the artistic diversity that has been found within the Muslim societies and civilizations. It is limited to beliefs, rituals, and practices, but it is missing the spiritual and the humanistic dimensions that has been experienced throughout the history and in the contemporary time. More importantly, we are missing the historical and the contemporary realities of Muslims in general, also while talking about the Quranic verses as well. So, how this gap can be minimized? Okay, so have a look at this picture. This is, by the way, is a picture from the PK movie. It is an Indian movie. And if you could try to identify which person belongs to from which religion in the chat box. I cannot see the participant. But if you guys can, so in this picture, if you guys can identify who belongs to which religion and write it down in the chat box. Yes, Mashi, Hindu, Muslim, Christians, yes. But like, are you saying that the person in orange shirt belongs to the Hindu community, The white one is the Christian, something like this. Left to right, Hindu, Christian, Sikh. Okay. Thank you. Okay. Thank you, Ramit. Okay, so let's find out from which culture background these people belong to. So this is basically, this person is going to talk in Hindi, Urdu. However, the subtitles are available in English, so we can understand.
Hello, Ji.
Can you guys hear the audio? Fine, sir?
Yes, we can.
Yes, those who have already seen the movie, I know, but it's fine. Okay.
Hello, Ji. साडा नाम सुखविंदर सिंह बेदी. अस्सलामुअलैकुम. मेरा नाम अब्बास अली याकूब है. जय जैनेंद्र. मैं महावीर जैन. Hi, I'm Christopher D'Souza.
नमस्कार, मैं जगत जननी सानी.
Yes, so as Rosina has highlighted in the chat box that the dress code was a misleading. So basically the movie was around something else. However, what I was trying to communicate through this scene was that by missing out these tools, these things that we talked about in the previous slide, what we are doing is we are providing students with minimum tools through which they are understanding a religion. So it could be through the appearance, maybe even through the name, but how we can maximize that toolkit and give them broader understanding of the religion so that when they encounter any variation or something unique that they might have not read about, they could deal with it properly. So what am I suggesting here is that if we could see religion from the civilizational lens and through its artistic culture. So when we are doing it, we are trying to understand that religion is not just about faith, practices, and beliefs and rituals. It has been part of the civilization. It has gone through several changes. And these changes could be understood through the artistic culture that has been found throughout the history of the religion and even in the contemporary time. However, there are limitations and that we can discuss later as well. So what is an art piece? So an art piece is a living object. So so art piece gives you the first-hand information about the culture, ideas, values of a people who were living in that particular time period. It gives you the accurate picture of how people were interacting with other communities and how people were developing themselves as well. And it gives students a chance to develop their own creative and imagination. And how it can be incorporated in our RE classrooms. So the resources and activities that I'm going to discuss are from the British Museum and Victoria Albert Museum and online resources which are being taken from our Fund Museum.
Rubina, there is a gray box coming on the right side of the screen. Possibly if you can remove that. Maybe it's a chat box open or a video panel if you can. Yeah, it's better. It's smaller, better now. Thank you.
Okay, so let me just okay, so what we are trying to do here, so let's take an example of the pillars of Islam. So when we are teaching about the pillars of Islam, and I remember teaching it in my mainstream school, one of the pillars of Islam is Hajj. And when I was doing this, I created an experiential journey for my students. So whatever happens during the Hajj, I ask my students to do it at the same time. However, how I could have enhanced their understanding of Hajj through these artistic pieces that are right in front of you. Number one is the 21 Stones by Idris Khan. It is presently, I think, at the display of Al-Bukhari Gallery at British Museum. Basically, these are the 21 paintings that depicts about the throwing of stone at the Satan. So it's enchanting that ritual through the picture, through the artistic depiction. And nobody would have thought about depicting something like this in this artistic manner. And it contains 100 poetry which are being repeated. On the left-hand side, you will see that this is a tile piece that shows about the Khane Kaaba in Makkah. And that is a verse that states about the importance of Makkah and how Hazrat Ibrahim alayhi salam prayed here and built this place. And moreover, how it is important for Muslims to perform Hajj if they could do so. And this has been written in almost most of the Hajj columns or Hajj-related content that are being distributed. But not limited to this. How about if I could add up something more in that journey of understanding what it is like for the Muslim? How about I add this poetry from Nasir Khusro that would develop that in-depth understanding of how Hajj has been seen by different people, why they perform Hajj. So if you have a glimpse of this poetry, you would see that Nasir Khusro is highlighting the philosophical idea behind the Hajj, that it's not just about throwing stones at the Satan, but working on your own self, debating with your own ego and performing your own or surrendering yourself towards the God. Moreover, if we move on towards this part, so if we talk about the mosque or the masjid that are being built, so have you seen this place, this picture before? Yes or no in the chat box. If you have seen this picture before, or if you have seen this before, it is at Victoria Albert Museum. It is a member of a mosque. And if you could see that it has so many details, like it has geometrical features, it has patterns and everything else. And we could ask students that why there are so many geometrical patterns and designs are being used in making this member. And not only that, we know that in mosque, we usually don't find any picture of human or even animal, and there is no picture of God in Muslim societies and civilization. However, during the Mughal time period, these two tiles say a very different stories. So when Mughals were interacting with the Chinese people, they got inspired from that symbols like dragons and phoenix, and they use it in their tiles. And not only that, these tiles were then being used at the religious context as well. So see, there is a shift from not using any image to using certain images in different tiles. And it shows positive relationship between different cultures. And this one is my favorite because look at this picture. It depicts an image of a marketplace that you would find in a typical Pakistani or maybe Indian market, not as it is, but to some extent. However, it is based on Nasiruddin Tusi's Akhlaq-e-Nasri, that is the ethics of Nasri. And what it is depicting, it is not just showing you the picture of bazaar that existed during the Mughal time period, but it is also telling you different stories that the people coexisted, the rich, poor, people of color, and the honest dealing that has been taken place in that marketplace. So see how one written piece has been converted into a picture format. And it just not depicts one side of the story, but it depicts a lot more than that. And there are many more collections that exist at Our Museum, British Museum, Victoria Albert Museum that can be used, and there are guided ones as well. However, these are some of the questions that could be used for further guiding that inquiry or that reflection during these kind of activities when you're creating exhibitions or using art in your own classrooms. I incorporated in my classroom. So I was preparing for an art exhibition on Fatimid, and what I was trying to achieve was that how Fatimid art tells us about the civilization and the culture that existed at that time, and how people communicated through trade and these artistic culture that existed at that time. Yeah. So these are the pictures that I have taken from the IIS secondary curriculum, of which Farah has already talked about. And these are some guiding questions that I created for my students, so that whenever they are going to from one piece to another, they have something to visualize on. And this is how my art exhibition looked like. It is very minimum. I placed some pictures, details, started to decorate it with some dupattas that are the coverings, created a banner, some lightning, and my students did not like music because it distracted them, so I did not play any music. But this is how this whole exhibition in the classroom looked like. And if you could observe that students are engaged with the pieces at at different areas. So what are the outcomes that we are trying to achieve by portraying these artistic pieces in our classroom, or by introducing these artistic pieces? We are trying to remove the stereotype and the strangeness that exists in our students. We are trying to make the religion and the culture speak for itself, and we are incorporating and trying to build up the analytical skills as well. And sometimes these artistic pieces would also would be ingrained with this religious theology as well. What are the possible challenges? Well, one of the possible challenges could be that these art pieces are being used to enhance their understanding rather than we diminish the understanding of complexity. So these art pieces should not be presented in a manner that would say that this is the only way to understand it. However, it should enhance or open their mind to understand that there are multiplicity and complexity within the religion. And the decontextualization of the object. So somebody asked a similar question during the Farah sessions that if we are decontextualizing objects sometimes, that why this style might have been used or why this thing has been created. Sometimes we don't know about these artifacts, honestly, but sometimes we do know what is the story behind these artifacts. So bring out those stories in your classroom as well if you read through that, if you come across through them while going through these websites. Thirdly, that sometimes we are confusing students with many abstract ideas, and it could be a bit dangerous to do so. And lastly, teachers' understanding of the religion and the artistic culture. So it also depends upon how much teacher knows about the religion and the culture and the artistic culture that existed in that time period. And of course, we usually don't get much time in our classroom. And there are resource constraints as well that we have to face in our classroom.
Thank you. So good morning, everybody. This is Al-Karim Datu, and with my colleague Alexis Stones, we are going to present, as Philip mentioned. Just want to introduce the title first, and then Alexis would elaborate this further and make an introductory remarks. Basically, this presentation is sharing a view that there is a pedagogic purchase in colonial, post-colonial theoretical concepts. Two of them we are engaging with notion of worldliness concept discussed by work of Edward Said, especially in his work on the world, the text, and the critique. And we are exploring this notion through an empirical study, which we are going to present here, and the notion of praxis by Paulo Ferrari and critical pedagogical notion. And we are arguing that these both post-colonial theoretical perspectives have rich insights and pedagogical utility in RE pedagogy, especially RE in the context of a multicultural society where they have students from immigrant communities, and those communities themselves are carry their own diversity. So this is basically a point of departure for this presentation. And over to you, Alexis, and then I will again come back.
Thank you, Al-Karim. Just to introduce myself and our connection, please can I have the next slide, Al-Karim? Thank you. So Al-Karim and I met because Al-Karim was sharing a module with Professor Farid Panjwani at UCL a few years ago, probably about 5 years ago now, on ethics and imagination. We met through this because I did some work on the use of art in RE. We discussed Al-Karim's work, his research, which he'll be sharing with you shortly, which looks at, it's an empirical study with participants from 3 generations in the Ismaili Muslim diaspora in Canada. Now, at another stage, I was teaching on the STEP program. I know we have lots of people in the conference and on the call who are associated with the STEP program, so I don't think it needs any explanation, but Al-Karim will look at that briefly for those who aren't familiar. I was teaching on the STEP program, as well as teaching on the PGCE postgraduate teacher education program in religious education at UCL. So when Al-Karim presented his work for the STEP community, you know, assuming lots of resonance with the global Ismaili community who were training here in London, we were suddenly made aware that this has further resonance. It has resonance for a global community in the teaching community here, generally speaking, in England, and with particular attention to the context of religious education. Because of where people are coming from, the students in the classroom, and also the curriculum as well. So we think there are big resonances here. So we've embarked on this collaboration. We've been working together for a few years now, discussing these connections and resonances. So we're asking ourselves, we're exploring this question and asking you as colleagues whether post-colonial concepts that we will be discussing today can inform an RE pedagogy. Thank you. And also, Al-Karim, should we say briefly where we're from? So I'm from the Institute of Education at UCL, working on the religious education program there, leading that program. Al-Karim, do you want to tell people?
Yes, I'm currently working in a university in Pakistan, in Sindh province in Pakistan, Sakhar IBA University. And prior to that, I have worked at the Institute of Ismaili Studies and Aga Khan University Institute for Education Development. And this research was done during my role as a research coordinator at the Institute of Ismaili Studies, London, where we researched within the Canadian Ismaili community. So yeah.
Thank you. So we have met across many different boundaries to be discussed later. So just to put the Worldviews paradigm in perspective, I'm sure there are people on the call who are very familiar with it and some perhaps not. So a brief overview. Religious education has typically since the 1980s or 1970s been in a world religions paradigm in which there are clear distinctions between religions, and we are now moving into what we're terming in the religious education community a worldviews paradigm, and lots of people will be referencing this over the next few days of the conference, but to frame it briefly, the worldview paradigm acknowledges one's own worldview, which is a sort of an aggregate of the relationship that one may have with several institutional worldviews, and these may include one's home traditions, one's community, one's peers, one's politicization, other authorities as well. So that there is an understanding that there's sort of dialectics and fluidities there. In the classroom, there is a focus on lenses, disciplinary lenses, so that this highlights the the subjectivity of the worldview framework. But as yet, to draw on Richard Quay, who is a part of the conference, he acknowledges that it is under-theorized, this balance of the disciplinary epistemologies that we have and the knower, the identity of the knower, the relationship of the knower with knowledges is very under-theorized dimension of the broader knowledge debate, which is particularly significant in RE. So that's our context, and we're hoping to address that too. Can I have the next slide, please, Al-Karim? Back to you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So we thank you, Alexis. So this focus on the knower. So the broader question is that in today's contemporary multicultural classroom, you know, who are the knowers? What are their cultural backgrounds? What are their biographies? What are the histories and the memories and the missing elements that they bring to the classroom? And this, especially, this research is looking at the lived worlds of the knower. And this mural, Alexis would touch back and explore more in detail towards the end of the presentation, but I just want to present this image of a movement, intersections, interactions, displacements, a point of departure, home and the host, just to give a context of the context of the diasporan community. And this sculpture by Bruno Catalano, this bronze sculpture, I think it's a very apt image which problematizes, you know, who is an immigrant, and the missing elements that we see. And there's a very interesting, the lot can be said on the whole image, but just I'm touching that. So this missing element, I am referring this as the memories and the forgetting. So the missing elements that a knower from, you know, the post-colonial context or other contexts through the migration that brings to the host society. There are memories which are missed of the home, but also there is a conscious effort to forget certain parts, especially the traumatic parts. And this whole debates on the refugee education, the forced migration, this sort of a tension between the memory and forgetting is very much live in the lived world of the knowers, of the students who come to the RE classroom in a particular host society. So this image basically is a tone setter for the discourse of diasporian Ismaili community that we are talking. Most of you are already familiar with Ismaili Muslim community, but I just do very brief introduction that Ismaili Muslim community is an interpretation of a Shia branch of Islam and has a presence over 21 countries in the contemporary world. And Ismaili community is a minority within a minority Shia within the broader Muslim. And then a Muslim again becoming, you know, a minority or majority, depend on the location. So all these demographic layers are very much important to understand the notion of the worldliness and its implication on the characterizing the worldliness, the existential realities of the students. So this is about Ismaili Muslim community, the Nizari Ismaili Muslim community. That are different sects. Those who are interested to explore more about Ismaili, I would recommend Dr. Farhad Daftari's work, which is considered as quite a solid book on the history and the contemporary Ismailism, so they could explore further. To just give you a brief context of this research, that this research was carried out by the Institute of Ismaili Studies, London, where I was leading this as a research coordinator. But the problematic that behind this research was an exploration, because there was concern shown by Ismaili top leadership that are our second generation youth, especially living in a Western society, losing touch with their local religious tradition, their values, especially as they intermingle in the Western societies in the multicultural context. So there were some concern about a rise of secularization, for example, French secularization in Britain, and so forth. there was an indicator that, you know, there was an observed decline in some parts of the world where Ismaili youth, you know, less attending Jamaat Khanas. Jamaat Khanas are spaces of worship in Ismaili context, like mosque and other, you know, equivalent. There were a rise in interfaith, intercommunal marriages. So in UK, Canada, and in the Europe, there are 40% of Ismaili youth are marrying outside their community, which was less the case when, you know, before the migration to the West. And our distance being used. So these were some of the concern of the top Ismaili leadership, and there was a suggestion by, you know, the leadership. There was a guidance from the His Highness Aga Khan that we need to explore this process. This is a complex process, and this complex process needs to be researched to guide the thinking about educating and the educational response to be given to this situation. While most of this has a different dimension, connotations, and the context, we are presenting here from this research a slice which we have titled that we are exploring when we went into the lived world, you know, what are the characteristics of the young youth, Ismaili youth living in Canada, and how this has implication on STEP education particularly. You know, those who are familiar with the STEP, this is a centralized teacher education and the curricula developed by the Institute of Ismaili Studies, implemented in all over the context of the Ismaili religious education system. So this research is basically looking at the lived worlds and what Alexis mentioned about the knower. So knower not as an abstract homogeneous category, but the knower with their lived particularities, complexities, biographies, memories, sometimes traumas, and as they discover the new, you know, society. So how the tension between the old and the new plays out. Some of the theoretical, I could explain this more in the question answer, but this research was informed by work of Arjun Appadurai, anthropologist of globalization, work of Edward Said, from where we draw concept of worldliness, Baba, Homi Bhaban, especially his work on, you know, the detailed worldliness, especially his work on third space, cultural hybridity. These are some of the key theoretical references which this research draws in and tries to sort of enrich this theorization. The methodology, so I have discussed about the concern. So broader question that this research explored was how Ismaili Muslim youth negotiate their sense of self and belonging in a globalizing multicultural Canada. What mechanism maintains youth connection with the roots and emergent roots in the multicultural society? What are some experiences of being a Muslim in Canada, contemporary Canada? What are some continuities and ruptures? And I think this continuity and ruptures within Ismaili tradition and the sense of belonging is very much central to this notion of worldliness and their travel between the home and the host cultural and social affiliation. So this qualitative research focused on the lived world, contextualized, personal, individual, family. This is in contrast to, you know, the abstract and the student being looked through the lens of culture. But this research also advocates to emphasize on the individual, the biographies. Hence, the narrative sociological touch to this research is also there. I personally humbly believe that this research makes an important contribution in the sense that it approaches the exploration through multi-generational lens. And I think this intergenerational transmissions of values, religious identity markers are very much active in the lives of a youth. So this research participants, informants included Generation 1, Generation 1.5, those youth who entered the new society at the age of puberty, and Generation 2 in Ismailis in Canada, those who were born in Canada but have their home origins belong to either East Africa, Afghanistan, India, Pakistan, depends on where they came from. I also would like to highlight research positionality, my own role within the research. Myself am an Ismaili Muslim in terms of belonging, religious faith-wise, but also as a student of sociology and ethnography. So there was an academic role to it, and my positionality at the Institute of Ismaili Studies while I was doing this. So this tension between the institutional and the lived, which is referred by several theorists and researchers, is very much active, which has affected not only, the positioning of this research at times, but also on my own as a researcher. And in most of the discourse, the researchers' biographies and the impact of research on the researcher is less discussed. But I think this is some other platform where we will discuss. So basically, this research traveled through what I call various texts, from field text to research text to policy text, because these final reports were presented to the Board of Governors at the Institute of Ismaili Studies, because they had to draw, a policy decision, especially informing STEP education, STEP training education, informing the guidelines to the ITRAs. If I could quickly highlight some of the emergent findings, thematics, and I would first very briefly touch on this, and then we'll pick one or two to elaborate it further. The others I could elaborate in the question answer if there are any. So in the lived world of the youth, some of the things that the acculturation has a major, of course, it's quite when you migrate, there is an experience of socializing, acculturing in a new society. And this brought tensions amongst the language, the gender roles, and the sometimes new beliefs, new norms that they had to encounter while experiencing the new society. And at times the language, for example, in Afghan context, we were having a discussion there was a grandfather and a grandson in the same focus group discussion, but they were talking in a different language and through translator. As in Montreal, Quebec, Afghan grandson was a bit disconnected away from the Dari, Persian Dari, and he was more towards, French, because in order to settle into a new Quebec society, he had to spend energies and time to learn language. So this was seen by the first generation as if it's like a distancing from the tradition, the cultural tradition, but while for the youth, it was more so an adjusting and responding to the new economic and educational demands of the society. Similarly, there were tensions in the gender roles. Girls have to go and work, do some part-time jobs, which was not always appreciated in the traditional society back home. So these tensions were very much experienced by the youth. As one Afghan youth girl commented that we are a sandwich generation between the expectation of our elders and the expectation of our new society. So these are some of the tension which were very much apparent and operative in the life of the dead. There was another theme that comes up is tradition, continuity, and ruptures. This was from the first generation perspective, because some of the youth who have been born in a new society, like in Canada, there was an issue of language, and hence the language of rituals, religious rituals, and the devotional literature, we call ginans, which are sung. It's like a devotional literature. Youth were not able to understand the language of the ginans. Now these issues are historical reasons. Institute and the community took certain decisions of what to prioritize in education. And this has to do with the social history of Ismaili religious education also. But there was a tension in the life in the real world. Sorry?
Time to wrap up, please.
Yes. The third I would just highlight is the hyphenated identity, where youth were presenting themselves as Canadian Ismailis. So if just to point out that there were affiliations and affiliative factors which were played out in the lives of the Ismaili youth. Family, imamat, jamaat khana, religious rituals which were grounding, and acculturation, education, socialization, social relationship with the other communities were affiliative factors where they were building new relationships. This was intention, and I think what we are trying to argue, that this intersection between filiation and affiliation is a pedagogic space where critical attention needs to be made. Over to you, Alexis. For
sorry that we have to rush through this wonderful empirical work that you have done, but just thank you for ending on filiation and affiliation, because this is the space that we're wanting to explore, isn't it? So to come back then to the worldviews situation, on the one hand, it's a heuristic, you know, it's intended to help us understand what it is to live a religious or non-religious perspective, and the interaction between both of those potentially. And the deconstruction of the worldview, you know, is another layer of that heuristic, where we have epistemology, moral authority, practice, behavior. And yet, this framework is so academic, it is so grounded in scientific positivism, and the affiliation and filiation dialectic that Al-Karim has just pointed to, but didn't, you know, we hope we'll have a chance to discuss as well, points to aspects of lived religion or lived perspectives that are poetic. They have ontological dimensions that are grounded in that poetic experience. They are emergent. They're the result of pluralism. It's very complex, and sometimes the scientific positivist approach is not enough to capture that and to create a space for dialogue and for learning. So can I have the next slide, please, Al-Karim? We draw, of course, on the work of Martha Shaw, Praxis, her work with religion and worldviews literacy, that an understanding of the category that is religion and worldviews, and the necessary encounter that comes as a result of understanding that category and the dispositions. The subject is emerging in a way that the disciplines are now recognized as being fallible. Knowledge through the disciplines is contested, and that constitutes Jung's idea of powerful knowledge, that we see the disciplines as fallible. And perhaps this understanding of the filiative and the affiliative can help us understand a way to relate more authentically towards these disciplines. We'll hear later about the hermeneutical approaches, but we really are proposing that we need to find ways to move beyond these academic concepts. I've done work with my colleague Jo Fraser-Pearce on the notion of epistemic literacy that recognizes that knowledge is not hierarchical, and that there are capabilities that we can develop in the classroom that go beyond the classroom in terms of age and stage and situated learning, to recognize the relationships between different kinds of epistemic environments. And this work of affiliative and filiative dialectic is so important to understanding this at a meaningful level. Other colleagues, of course, are working and listed at the bottom there. But if we can just go to the next slide, please, Al-Karim, to finish. Pre-service teachers, that's who I work with, and that's where we really want to start. This is a huge work that we think is very important to understand modern plurality, engage with intergenerational experience and epistemologies. Shai's work really recognizes this. Pluralism, often celebrated, for others it is a burden. It is something that's highly nuanced. And it starts perhaps with the teacher, with their self-understanding, their practice, to be able to acknowledge the complexity of plurality, and to recognize as well that whilst this is increasingly changing, it's very contemporary in many ways, it's also a very old situation. So that dialogue with intergenerational context is so important. And the last slide, please, Al-Karim. Thank you. To come back to this wonderful image that Al-Karim presented. We have a new paradigm in RE, but we have a very old situation, an ongoing, perhaps even ancient situation of the challenges and opportunities, multiplicity, movement and diaspora. They're increasingly complex. And we think that a work like this is really helpful to think about this beyond those academic frameworks, which sort of limit us really in understanding, self-understanding and encounter with colleagues, with ourselves, with others. This marvelous piece by Rina Saini Kalat is from an exhibition on contemporary art around migration in Boston at the ICA. And she herself was, her family fractured as a result of partition, 1947. And the name of this piece, as you see, Woven Chronicle 2011 to 2019, it's based on data of movement of people, movement of communications and labor. And it looks like wool, it looks like textiles, it looks like something very ancient and binding, but actually on closer examination, it is wire. And a lot of that wire is twisted to resemble barbed wire, which reminds us of the complexities of these situations, the communication lines that bring people together, but also that separate them too, the tensions that children, young people, teachers, families are all navigating, and we need to bring an awareness to this in the classroom as we go forward in our subject. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Alexis and Al-Karim. It was really brilliant. I open the floor then for questions. I don't want to dominate as chair. So questions from the floor, please. Please raise your hands using the reactions button. Can I kick off in that case if there's no one forthcoming? I was thinking about the challenging status of plurality that you referred to. And I wondered if there's anything that comes out of Al-Karim's empirical research on Ismailis in Canada that speaks to that. I mean, Canada is sort of such a strong part of Canadian identity. It comes from celebrating this state multiculturalism, the presence of pluralism there. Does that make it more difficult for Ismailis in Canada to express a sort of nervousness about pluralism, and that some of the consequences of pluralism may include intermarriage or secularization?
Alexis, you want me to respond? Alexis?
Please respond.
Yeah. Thank you, Phillips. I think on the one hand, I think, the youth Ismailis, especially, they appreciate a lot, of course, the Imam's guidance, and there are a lot of emphasis on the speeches and what they call faramins of the Imam, which guides them to have a pluralistic mindset. So youth value that pluralism in a way. But in terms of the tension, I could see is that, within Ismaili communities, there is a lot of diversity. So for example, Ismailis from Afghanistan, Tajikistan, subcontinent, the Ismailis from the East Africa, all that, they are now coexisting, living as a community. And sometimes some of the rituals but also there is some sense of accommodation happening there. But diversity at the deeper level, so the within, I would say, the intra-community level diversity sometimes needs more understanding, especially in realms of curriculum and pedagogy.
Right.
But at the level of Jamaat Khana, there is an attempt to accommodate and give space and expression to this diversity. However, vis-a-vis the broader society, one tension that comes through what I call the mediated, impact of media, especially as it presents the image of Muslims in Canadian media, for example, where Ismaili youths were feeling bit, vulnerable as to how to, respond to this, what they call mediated image of global Islam. But at the same time, they feel, sort of a sense of security and pride by being Ismaili, because they think and believe that their their imam being progressive and being a bridge between the West and East. So there is some representation of, what does it mean to be a Muslim. So there were multi-layered connections, tensions that I found in this research.
Thank you. Thank you. Are there any other questions on Alexis and Al-Karim? Abai.
I have a question for Dr. Al-Karim. So you mentioned that on a policy level, the purpose of the research was to develop some sort of recommendation for the leadership of Ismaili community. So my question is, could you please just list maybe a few of the recommendations that you developed after completion of your research, and how these recommendations were taken by the Ismaili leadership?
Yes, a very good question. Thank you for this. I would highlight two recommendations that I presented in my report. One was I highlighted generation 1.5, those who were coming at the age of puberty. They were having, this category was experiencing a lot of, at times, cultural shock between the norms, the gender roles that I mentioned. So my recommendation was that, Ismaili youth, this is an obvious statement, but at the policy level and the response level, that it's not a homogeneous category. There is a need to pay special attention and some support for the transition for generation 1.5. So that was one recommendation, and of course in terms of support in education, but more so in support in what the felt tension that they felt, like the metaphor of sandwich generation. So they felt an ambivalence, a tone between the two worlds, as it were. So generation one, I emphasize that with the youth camp, youth education, generation 1.5 needs more support. The second, I think, the more important, and it has a larger strategic implication, I personally believe, was it that how the center, the institution views at the youth. For example, for the center from the local Muris, and maybe this is like this whole notion of hyphenated identities. But what I felt that for generation 2, Canada is their home. It's not like a host society that was the case for the generation 1. Now, in that context,
I think Al-Karim's frozen there. Perhaps we should, do you want to carry on, Alexis?
Oh, this is very much Al-Karim's work. I mean, he was talking about I can't pick up from where he went. I just want to highlight this notion of filiation and affiliation. It's just really, really interesting, and that an understanding of how that is lived requires such a, oh, Al-Karim is back, but just finish my sentence, requires such a qualitative engagement. It can't be captured in this positivist approach. It does have to be through dialogue and back to, detailed qualitative research. Back to you, Al-Karim, you can finish your sentence.
Hi, thank you. Let me just share my screen.
Thanks very much.
Can we see it?
Yes.
Thank you. Right, so thank you for having me. So I'm going to speak on how I have used the concept of ijtihad in the classroom in my secondary school setting, and how it's unlocked a lot of understanding when it comes to Muslim law and Muslim practice, which has helped our students understand how Islam works, if I can say that. So obviously, as was hinted upon a bit earlier, there are kind of three areas where this has come from. So I first am going to just quickly acknowledge that in Islam, there's diversity kind of for one sole purpose, and that is because of epistemology. So where does our knowledge come from? For some people, it is text only. For others, it's text plus rationality. And this has an impact on your worldview, and this has an impact then on your practice. Now, the reason why I have, just to go back to the start, sorry, the reason why I tried this is because in my teaching of Islam specifically, I always struggled to kind of tell our students why there's diversity in Islam. Now, I don't mean by diversity the Sunni-Shia split. I mean diversity in interpretation, in law, and in practice. Because naturally, many students and many young people might think there's only one way of doing Islam, or Islam has only one opinion on a moral matter. And when you introduce an alternative opinion, that seems as like an offshoot opinion as opposed to an authentic one that has weight to it. And a bit about my context as well that kind of made me do this is that the context that I teach in right now, the school that I teach in is, I'd say, 95% Muslim from a Bangladeshi background. And encountering this in my classroom, I just found that many of our students see the world in one way because their neighbors, their classmates, the community is an echo chamber. So the moment I introduced them to something that was not from their worldview or not from what they agree with, they found it cognitively hard to accept this. Now, ijtihad was something that you teach in Key Stage 5. And I thought that was great, but I was thinking, isn't that too late? Because when you get to Key Stage 4 and you have to look at different themes within religion and you have to apply Islamic knowledge to different themes, that our students don't actually know why in Islam there's difference of opinion on abortion, euthanasia, leadership of women, so on and so forth. So I thought to myself last year, okay, Key Stage 5 is too late and Key Stage 4 is too late as well. I want to tell students early on why in Islamic practice there is diversity, so that when they get to these ethical themes in Key Stage 4 and 5, they naturally accept there's diversity within Islam. I think we do it in Christianity quite well with Protestantism, Catholicism, and other forms, situation ethics, for example. But I didn't find this in Islam. So I think, I don't want to say I'm the first, but I'm not aware of anyone who teaches this at Key Stage 3. So I'm going to kind of share kind of my lesson resources, how I do it in the classroom. This year was the first time I did it, and I can genuinely say it worked. And I would like to think in the following years coming, when our students get to GCSE and A-level, when they study a topic within Islam, naturally they would be able to accept difference of opinion. And it's very important in my context, especially because in my context, as I mentioned earlier, there is only one way of Islam for our kids there. And I think it's very important for our students to know that actually in Islam, especially in moral issues, there's no correct answer at the moment. Everyone on the table of opinion, kind of everyone's opinion counts. So what I do is that prior to all of this, my students learn about the concept of worldview and how your worldview is influenced by several factors. Religion is one of them, like experience, culture, geography, upbringing, all this shapes our worldview. So I tell our students that even though 30 of you in this room might be from a Bangladeshi Muslim background, that does not mean you have the same worldview because your experience might differ, especially. So in my unit on Islam, I teach Islam from a historical perspective. I do some theological as well. So I kind of do it through the biography of Muhammad. I start with pre-Islamic Arabia. I look at Muhammad's first revelation and what he taught and why the Meccans rejected his revelation. I then speak about his hijrah and the teachings that he taught, ethical living. I then end with his final sermons and then Sunni Shia split after his death. But I added this lesson on at the end because I had a spare lesson in my budget to do this. And I thought, right, let me do one on Islamic thought and how it's developed. So I kind of tell our students that there's a 1400-year gap between now and Muhammad. And naturally speaking, when you have, the further you get away from the source of the knowledge, the harder it's going to be to find the direct knowledge that came first because things get diluted and things change and things move on. And I kind of speak about historically to our students that when Muhammad was alive, it was very easy for the human being, for the Muslim, to go to him to ask a question. because the man is deemed to get revelation from the Almighty himself. But what happens 500 years afterwards, when great-grandchildren of the companions of Muhammad are now no longer alive and the teachings are being moved on a bit? So I kind of open up this idea that, naturally speaking, like in all religions, when you move away from the founder, diversity of thought naturally happens. And this is natural and not a bad thing. I even then speak about how geography has an impact on this. So again, I speak with the context of our students that many of you who come from Bangladesh, your ancestors migrated there and they were influenced by a certain way. So I speak about when Islam went to Greece, for example, Greek philosophers influenced the way Muslims thought and vice versa. When Muslims moved to India and people of India converted to Islam, their Hinduism would have impacted the way they saw Islam and vice versa. So I speak about geography having a big factor in the development of Islamic thought. So I kind of then open up, well, what do Muslims do to express themselves but remain within the laws that Muhammad gave them a long time ago? So I kind of give some examples. So the first one I look at is like the head covering. So I show an image of the lady on the left who lives in America, and she is wearing a head covering in a very different way to many of the mothers of our students who cover their hair fully. She's got a bit of a head out. It's a very, very nice patterned head covering and very, very modern and very, very cool. I am speak about, well, what about Nike, the brand? Who would have ever thought that 1,000 years ago that there'd be a head covering for an athlete? I then speak about also other kinds of diversity. The one in the bottom, COVID. When COVID happened, churches opened up places of worship were allowed to have 30 people there. Churches would be allowing Muslims to pray there. And I thought, actually, that would never happen in a Muslim-only area. It only would happen in the West when there's churches there and you would be able to pray in a church. An image that I love using is the one on the right. Now, and this is not an image that I took, but it's an image that I've seen. And I saw this image in Iraq. And a bit of personal kind of background here. So I'm a Shia Muslim. So when I go to Iraq quite often on the pilgrimage to Karbala, and one thing I love doing is that when I go to Karbala, I have this thing where I sit by the door and I just watch people walk in. And that's a very spiritual experience to me because I can tell from the people's reactions who's a local, who's here for the first time, and who's from which country. And when I'm there, I notice when Muslims pray or supplicate, the traditional hand gesture is the palm facing the heavens or facing the sky. And I noticed that sometimes when people walked into the shrine of Hussein in Karbala, they'd walk in with the namaste hand gesture. And I'm like, that man must be from India because Muslims don't do that unless your neighbor is doing that or your friend's doing that. So I kind of tell our students that this Muslim man on the right is praying, but instead of his hands or his palms facing the heavens, his hands are in the closed namaste gesture. This indicates to us and proves to us that we as human beings borrow from our neighbors. And I use the example of Christmas, that you in this room may not celebrate Christmas, but I guarantee you give your neighbors a Christmas card, a Christmas gift, and you wear a Christmas jumper sometimes as well, because we're influenced by our neighbors. So I'm kind of giving out, my students specifically, I'm trying to show them that not everything is the bubble that they live in. We have these influence out there. So I then introduced the famous narration of Ijtihad that was done, that was given by Muhammad to his companion Muad. And I use this example to kind of authenticate that Ijtihad is not some rebellious thing that I'm bringing forward. It's actually authentic in Islamic tradition. And it was there, at the time of Muhammad. That even in Muhammad's life, he sends a judge, Muad, to Yemen to be a judge there. And he praises Muad for using his independent reasoning alongside the Quran and Sunnah to come to a conclusion. Because Muad asked the questions to Muhammad that, look, Muhammad, if I can't find the answer in my two main sources, what do I do? And he goes, I'll do Ijtihad. And Muhammad praises him for doing this. So I again root this idea that Muhammad is the one who allowed Ijtihad to happen in his lifetime. After his lifetime, it should come naturally as well. Now, I then use a case study. I use music. Now, again, because in my school, phrases like music is haram is banded around just like that. Phrases like tattoos are haram, branded around like that. So again, I see my students with a very black and white thing. As a Muslim teacher myself, I sometimes get treated like, sir, is this allowed in Islam? My answer is always the same. It depends who you ask. And my students find that hard to accept because tattoos, for example. Sir, is it haram to get tattoos? Well, some scholars say yes, some scholars say no, but they want a black and white answer. So I use the example of music because music is something that our kids speak about quite a lot, especially in the month of fasting, when some of our students kind of don't engage with music lessons. And many parents ask the school, can you withdraw our children from music lessons in this month? So I use a music example, and I use the case study of the famous folk singer, Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan. Those of you who come from the Indo-Pak background would know that this man is the Michael Jordan of the music world and the folk singing world. He is the king when it comes to music, and someone I grew up in my household listening to, and also currently listen to as well, even though he's passed away. And I introduced Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan. I look at his worldview before I begin with. So again, one thing I'm doing right now in my curriculum is that whenever I bring in a scholar, a person, or a thinker, I give you their context of who they were. So I speak about Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan. He was from Pakistan. He was a pluralist when it came to his way of thinking, and he used to express himself through the use of music. And he was somebody who was seen as quite religious, but used music. And I speak about his travels across the world, where he interacts with people of different religions, and he even was someone who would participate in the hymns of other religions as well, because he was quite a pluralist. And I introduce him through this quote: when I sing for God, I feel myself in accord with Allah. And the house of God in Mecca is right in front of me when I sing, and I worship. When I sing for Muhammad, peace be upon him, our prophet, I feel like I'm sitting right next to his tomb in Medina. I'm paying respect to him and admitting myself that I accept his message. So I would say to our students that this man is, clearly a devout Muslim. Many of you in the room think music is haram, but this man is saying, actually, when I sing for God, it's my ultimate form of worship. I then play a video, which I'm not going to play, but you can find many of them, where I take 30 seconds of one of his songs that's about God, and I subtitled it as well. And he speaks about in this song that whether you call God Allah, whether you call him Ram, it is still the one God. And what I like about this clip as well is that the camera flips to the audience as well. And in the audience are people with turbans from the Sikh community. You've got people who are clearly white British, who may not be Muslim, as well as a Muslim audience there. So our students get an idea that this man was somebody who would appeal to the masses when it came to spirituality. So I open up kind of the topic of music through him. I then do this task where I begin to look at sources in Islam about music. So this is kind of a screenshot of my worksheet that I use. On the left-hand side, I've got sources. And on the right-hand side, I've got questions for students to think about and to write their response. What my aim in this task is for students to do is not to find the answer of is music allowed or not. My aim for them is for actually to do ijtihad. Now, in Muslim tradition, only the scholar, the cleric, the highest ranking scholar can do ijtihad, because obviously, like heart surgery, only a heart surgeon would do it who is qualified. So yes, there's a movement where some may say that anyone can do ijtihad, but I want our students to come in the classroom and find the process is actually quite hard. It's not as black and white as saying, oh, the Quran says so, therefore it's haram or it's allowed. So I go through the process. So I do this with them, and it's not something I leave with them on their own, because this is my year 8s, by the way. It's a 12, 13-year-olds doing this. So they need a bit of guidance there, and I do it with them. So the first thing I do is I tell our students, right, actually, there's actually no single word for music in the Arabic language. There's words for sound and rhythm and using the voice, but music in the way you know it in English is not there. So I say, here are some Quran verses on the left-hand side that some Muslim scholars use to kind of forbid music. And the Arabic word is lahu. But I tell students that this even word lahu is multi-translated. It can mean one thing or another. So in Arabic, I tell them, lahu means something that is useless or distracting. So I ask our students to begin with, the Quran is here clearly condemning things that are lahu. So I ask our students, put music to one side. What could examples of lahu be in the modern day world? So some of our students say, oh, using an app too much, WhatsApp, TikTok, that could be it. I say, okay, good. Why would some scholars deem music as haram, using the cross verses on the left-hand side. Well, music is distracting. It could be a waste of time. Use is distracting. Therefore, it could be something that's haram. I also flip it. Okay, why is lahu something that might not be to do with music? And our students say, actually, if you ban music based on time wasting or something useless, that's my phone, my TV, my other things becoming haram as well. Would you want to forbid that? They say no. I said, okay. So it's a bit more complicated than that. Let's go to some other sources. Let's go hadith then, the next area. I then introduced the word ghina in Arabic. So ghina again, in Arabic, I tried to find many translations of the word. It's very hard to translate. But the consensus I found from scholars was that singing that changes someone's mood. Okay? So the aim of music usually is to make someone feel happy or to feel sorrow, feel some kind of emotion, depending on the genre of the music. So I then introduced them to hadith and some scholarly opinions on this word ghina. So Muhammad says, stay away from ghina. Destroys modesty, kills manliness, leads to alcohol and drunkenness. Iblis was the first person to use ghina. So I kind of tell our students here, quite clear cut, isn't it? Ghina must be something that is haram. So I then unpack this. Okay, our students, what are the negative effects of ghina according to Muhammad? They come up with, lead you to alcohol, immodesty, so on and so forth. But I then ask this question, well, is ghina and music the same thing? Because I open up the question, right, if you think ghina is music, when you watch the news, are you going to mute the intro music to the news channel, for example? When you watch a film or a TV program, are you now going to mute the whole thing, watch subtitles, because the music in the background might be haram for you, no? They think about this, and actually music and ghina cannot be the same thing. Ghina is a very, very, very broad word. Music is a specific type of word. I then give a contrary piece of evidence. Well, when Muhammad arrived in Medina, they welcomed him with drums, and they were not condemned for doing so. That means here that Muhammad perhaps is allowing music. So again, what I'm doing here is not giving them the answer. The thought process here is the key thing. Last bits that I do, I then use actually Oxford Dictionary. Right, so what is the definition of music? And sorry, what is the definition of music? And I give that, I then talk about intention. I speak about, well, Al-Ghazali, one of the key Muslim scholars, says, if you're going to prohibit music, prohibit the bird songs as well that we have in the world today. I then give another kind of I'll wrap up soon. Another scholarly opinion regarding music being allowed in certain gatherings, Muhammad doing it. At the end, our students come up with, right, according to Ijtihad, can you tell me why music is allowed and not allowed? What they have done has hopefully worked out that in Islamic law, what is allowed and not allowed is not black and white. The purpose here is that when they get to key stage 4 and do abortion, euthanasia, women leadership, sexual relationships, all that stuff, I argue that in Islamic law, everything is up for interpretation. There's no almost truth at the moment, and this is okay in Islam. So I do it with regarding, the wearing of the trousers above the ankle. I interpret that. I talk about the beard as well as an example. Is it the full beard, mustache only, goatee? Why was the beard kept? All of this I go through them. At the end of it, the idea was for them to come with an understanding of how to use the classroom and hopefully unlocking a lot of Islamic thought. Thank you.
Everyone. Thank you, Salita, for setting that ground of talking about classroom, because I myself come from a similar background like Salita, and I'm going to speak to how I did one of the difficult topics in the classroom as a case study. So today my topic is to talk about the use of multiple perspectives in the secondary RE classroom and how teachers can bridge between what they teach for assessments and what they teach for skills that are going to be lifelong. I hope everyone is able to hear me clearly. Awesome. Before I go into the presentation itself, I would like to talk about a little bit of my personal background. So I have also spent 2 years in England studying for a double master's degree. One was in Muslim societies and civilizations, and the other one was in teaching. And while I was there between 2015 to 2017, I had some exposure of studying or teaching RE in the secular schools, in the mainstream schools like we call them. With little bit of that exposure and with my study of the curriculum materials that were available, I have tried to talk about how this skill or this tool of multiple perspectives is very important to the study of RE, and how perhaps teachers can venture into into the use of this tool into their classrooms. So before I talk into detail about multiple perspectives, I just wanted us to look at this picture, which is of a classroom, and imagine a student who is 12-year-old or 13-year-old or maybe 15-year-old sitting into this classroom, and think about the context of UK. You know, what might the student be thinking on a given day? Maybe they are worried about what they are going to have in lunch. Maybe they are worried about their evening football practice, or they might be thinking about a fight that they had with their sibling or with a friend. Or perhaps they are thinking about their neighbors who are belonging to a different religious tradition than them. Or they are thinking about life and the questions that life poses to them. Or perhaps they are thinking about, you know, a discussion that they had with one of their friends from another religious tradition. Our children, when they come into classroom, they come with all these thoughts, and they are the center of what we do in the classroom. So whatever we do, our end goal as teachers, and particularly as religious education teachers, is to bring about impact on them that is lifelong. And what does that lifelong impact mean, particularly when we are teaching RE in a UK context, because there is a breadth of content that we are trying to cover in a very limited period of time, and how can we make that meaningful for a student who is sitting in our classrooms? So these are some larger questions that I had in my head, and that I always think about when I think about RE. And one of the things that I have felt when I was exploring the curriculum in UK is that teachers have this problem in RE, that what should they teach? You know, that is an essential question that all of us are asking. And if we look into literature as well, these thoughts have been echoed, that teachers struggle with too much of content information. They struggle with this idea that whether they should approach content from the lens of achieving breadth, or they should go into the depth of the content. A lot of times teachers are worried about teaching for assessments, because eventually that is what students will be appraised on, or will, you know, progress to the next year of their studies. So there is a lot of worry around assessments. And finally, there are these larger questions that teachers are asking themselves, or I as a teacher ask myself, that how do I teach for subject-specific knowledge or subject-specific skills that will develop disciplinary expertise for my students, so that whatever they learn, they are able to apply that into other topics, other subjects that they are studying. Or how do what we teach them in a classroom setting in a particular subject helps them in their lived experience of life? How does it make it meaningful for their everyday life? So these are some questions that we grapple with as teachers, particularly as RE teachers. And when I was studying and when I was researching this idea of multiple perspectives, I came across something called the big ideas in RE. And I think this is a study that has been going on in the UK context, where they have refined what should teachers be aiming at when they are teaching in RE. And this is something that actually aligns with my personal philosophy of teaching religious education. So some of the big ideas that Kush highlights in her research, and she builds on Winster Gill's work on big ideas in RE, she suggests that when we are teaching religions, one of the ideas that we might focus on is this idea of change and diversity, that religions have interacted, or worldviews have interacted with time, with other other people, other religions, and there are things that have remained continuous in religious traditions, while there have things that have evolved. So how do we bring that idea into RE is one of the larger aims that RE should try and achieve. Another thing that the big ideas concept highlights is how there are words that are important to certain religious traditions. These could be sources of authority like scriptures, or words that have been said by the founders of religious traditions. But although religious education, or although religious traditions ascribe to these words and to these scriptures, they also move beyond it. They go and interact with arts. They go and interact with literal and figurative materials, and these could include their own values, their own experiences. So how a religious tradition is not limited to scripture only or to words only, it is experiences beyond that. And how do we bring that into the classroom? The third idea that big ideas in RE focuses on is that all religious traditions teach individuals about how to lead a good life. And you could find similarities across religious traditions. So it might be that Islam is teaching one thing, and at the same time Christianity or Judaism are teaching the same thing about leading a good life. So how do we find those commonalities? There is also this understanding that when we talk about religious education or religious traditions, it is not only about sticking to scripture, but it should be about making sense of life experiences. And it should be a lived experience of students, of the people who are part of that religion. So one should not limit in the study of religion to scriptures only or to authority only. It should be about what a common Muslim experience is. It should be about what a common Christian's experience is. Finally, there are two more things that Big Ideas focuses on, and that's how certain ideas in religious traditions hold extreme influence on communities, and how these ideas develop in interaction with culture and in interaction with power structures. And that has a lot to say when we approach any religious tradition, to look at how certain concepts in a religious tradition speak to people, speak to the politics of society, speak to the communities who are experiencing them. And finally, the final point that the Big Ideas theory makes is that although all these things are present in religious traditions, there is scripture, there is lived experiences, there are these grand narratives, but people may not ascribe to these narratives necessarily. So people may want to construct their own meanings, their own experiences around religion, and it may not be necessary that they always agree to what the big picture or the grand narrative about a religion is telling them. When I think about religious education, I ask myself that maybe religious education should not be only about sticking to the beliefs, but it should be about how we bring in all these big ideas into the exploration of a religious tradition. And what would that offer us? So some of my experiences tell me, and research also tells us this, that this will ensure that students are able to cope with diversity. When you look at the big ideas framework, and when you place content in that framework and explore it in that way, what it can achieve secondly is that it would help students to avoid stereotypes and generalizations about religions, because it would give them a diverse perspective, a spectrum of ideas to approach with. It would also help them to ask questions about authority. about comparisons between religions. And finally, it will give them skills of respecting other people's opinions, as well as developing their own worldview or developing their own thought processes about a certain concept. And I think these are the larger skills that ARI is focusing on, that ARI should be focusing on. And these are the things that would live lifelong with the students. These would remain with them, and these would be helpful in their everyday lives. So where does multiple perspective fit in all this discussion? If you look at what the big ideas are saying and what we are trying to achieve through these big ideas, it's very evident that one thing that we are trying to bring to students is this idea that there could be different ways of looking at things. There is not one way, one fixed way of approaching a religion or approaching people in our lives. And that is where I think that the skill of multiple perspective comes into play, because if we utilize it correctly in the classroom in an appropriate way, it can help us achieve, or it can help us direct ourselves to achieving these big ideas and to these larger competencies that we are talking about. So let me situate this now in a case study and explore with you that how a topic like jihad, which is part of the GCSE curriculum, can be approached from the lens of multiple perspectives. And if we do that, what are the possibilities that we will be able to achieve, or we will be able to lead our students to reach these competencies and these big ideas. So when we talk about the GCSE curriculum, one of the topics which is focused in the practices of Islam is jihad. And some of the concepts that the write-up covers in curriculum is the concepts of greater jihad, the concepts of lesser jihad. The curriculum also refers to sources of authority and wisdom in Islam. These include the Quran and the Hadith. Why probably the curriculum focuses on this, or why I have chosen this case study to talk about today, is because I believe that this is one of the concepts which is very meaningful to students' lives today. Given the global context, where there is a lot of discussion on Islamophobia, where there is a lot of discussion on Muslims who are leaning towards extremist views, and the recent world history. A lot of people have referred back to 9/11. Bruce referred it to in his presentation. So that is at the backdrop of the thought process for which I think this is an interesting case study to talk about multiple perspectives in the classroom. What are some opportunities if we approach jihad, or if teachers are teaching jihad in a multi-faith classroom? You could break stereotypes about Muslims as extremists when you talk about these concepts, and I will talk about how this can be done in a classroom, as well as there is an opportunity to understand sources of authority such as Quran in its own context, in the context when it was revealed in the 7th century. So before I talk about how I did it in the classroom, I would suggest that when teachers are approaching topics such as jihad in their classroom, there is a framework in which they can bring in multiple perspectives. So the framework that I'm suggesting is that, of course, talk about sources of authority and base perspectives from sources of authority. So do talk about Quran and do talk about Hadith, but what teachers can bring in is also historical perspectives on jihad, on the idea of jihad, as well as literary perspectives, which are symbolic in nature, which look at the literature or the artistic exploration of jihad in the Muslim tradition. Before I tell that what are other sources that are missing from the curriculum, let's look at what the curriculum actually does. So when I read the write-up of curriculum, of the GCSE curriculum, I found out that the curriculum already talks about some of these sources. For example, the curriculum talks about hadith and how Prophet Muhammad discusses this idea that if there is something bad going on or something, if you witness an evil going on in society, how you must change it by using the force of your hand. If you can't do that, use the force of your tongue to stop that. If you can't do that, at least consider it bad at heart, consider it evil at heart. This, in the curriculum, this relates to the idea of the idea of greater jihad, where a person is struggling against something, against injustice or against something that they see as evil. And this necessarily does not require going to war or raising up arms. So that is one idea that curriculum addresses in itself. The curriculum also brings in 2 Quranic verses which talk about how if one person kills one person, they kill the whole humanity, and how if one person saves a life, they save the whole humanity. In another verse, the curriculum builds the context that the Quran gave permission at the time of the Prophet to Muslims that they could actually conduct war or they could conduct fight because they were wronged in certain contexts. So this is what the curriculum does establish. But what are the gaps that the curriculum does not cover or that are missing? There is a lot of critique in the research as well, that when the GCSE curriculum approaches Islam, it does so in an ahistorical manner. So Panjwani and Revel in one of their research articles mentioned that there is no evolutionary history per se of Islam in the curriculum. And that is something that also echoes with my experience, that the evolution of jihad from Meccan time to the Medinan time is not delved into at depth. So students are not able to gauge or understand why was permission given in a certain context, or when jihad was talked about in the Meccan context, in what ways it was talked about. Similarly, in the curriculum, there is a particular statement where it says that there are certain circumstances in which Islam accepts that force needs to be used, but only ever in self-defense. Now, the problem with this statement is, as Panjwani and Revel put in their article, that it puts all the onus or all the agency on Islam as a phenomenon, and it does not talk about Muslims per se. So Islam is X or Islam is not X, and this is essentializing of Islam. So the Quran or the Hadith do give instructions about jihad, but it's Muslims who make meaning of it in different time periods. It's the meanings of the text are not fixed in time. Meaning is created over time by Muslims. So the agency is with Muslims and not with the Quran, and that is something that the curriculum does not explore at depth when looking at the case study of jihad. Similarly, one thing that gets missed out is how the idea of jihad is approached across time and space, and in treatises or in places other than scripture. So that, for example, how literature talks about jihad or how artistic explorations of jihad are presented, these sources somewhere get missed out on in the curriculum. So when I taught jihad in my classroom, how did I do that? And just for context, I did not teach it in a mainstream UK classroom. I have taught this to a group of Muslim students, but at the same age level. And even those Muslim students have had no exposure to Quran before. They have had no exposure to Hadith. They did not have any awareness of the Arabic language. So, and a lot of them were actually studying Islam in GCSE in their schools, while I was teaching this topic to them in the community school, where we talk about religious education at a community level. So my approach to teaching jihad was to first look at the sources of authority, that is the Quran. And what I introduced to my student was the polysemic use of jihad in the Quran. What does that mean is that when Quran approaches jihad, it uses the term jihad in many ways. It does not use it in one singular way. When the Quran talks about fighting, it uses the terminology qital, which again the curriculum does not address in the GCSE books. And when I approached this with the students in my classroom, what I did was that I gave them certain verses that were revealed in Makkah and certain verses that were revealed in Medina. And before giving them any context, I asked them to read these verses and make sense of it on their own. So what meaning do they derive out from these verses about the idea of jihad? Then we launched a research into the context of these verses as to when they were revealed, and when they were revealed, what was the state of the Muslims and why were these verses revealed. That helped the students to see that the term jihad is used in Meccan verses as well, but in a context of struggling, in a context of striving, and not in the context of armed warfare. And in the Medinan verses, it has been used in both ways, in the context of armed warfare as well, and also in the context of struggling on the way of God, in doing good deeds or in fighting injustices. Another approach that could be taken in the historical classroom is to explore how people have used the terminology of jihad in terms of political motives, and what are some development of rules that got developed historically over time as to when Muslims were to go to jihad, what kind of things they could do and what kind of things they could not do. This will give some historical perspective to students that can help them understand that the idea of jihad and the rules associated with it have evolved over time. And finally, just in the interest of time, I would talk about the literary perspective that needs to be introduced to the students that the curriculum does not do, but that when I introduced into the classroom helped my students to look at jihad in a broader perspective. On the screen, you can see three different people from the 13th century and the 11th century. These are philosophers, and Rumi, like we are aware, he's a Persian poet. A lot of us must have studied his works. All these three people, when they approach the idea of jihad, they give it a different meaning. And that meaning is to do with fighting the inner darkness, like we see in Tusi's writing. In Nasir Khosrow's writing, we see how he talks about jihad as war against ignorance. And in Rumi's writing, we see how he talks about jihad in the context of fighting the inner enemy as opposed to fighting the outer enemy. I would skip this context, but there are other explanations of jihad that we can find in contemporary Muslims' experiences. There are Twitter hashtags that were in use, which are #MyJihad, and you can explore them, that talk about how Muslims in today's times have tried to take back this word from the extremists and use it in their own practice. So yeah, I would hold it here, and Philip, maybe you can take questions and I can fill in the gaps.